You asked me about what it was like at Fort Bragg when I was there. I got there in December of '67 and stayed through December of '71. In '68 and '69 and '70 in particular, but '68 and '69 for the most part, it was pretty much the Wild West. It was an amazing society. There were 60,000 troops on the base, and trainees, 82nd Airborne and Special Forces, and a whole lot of people going to and from Vietnam, and so some of them were pretty wild to say the least. But the most amazing thing to me was the society outside the base and the drug culture and the violence and for want of a better term, the hippies going around. It really was kind of amazing. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that I basically knew what was going on because I was assigned to the Judge Advocate General's Corps and the headquarters, 18th Airborne Corps in Fort Bragg. And we knew what was happening because we were prosecuting it, defending it, and this, that, and the other. There was one series that you kind of wouldn't believe where I was told this fella had been in Special Forces training, gotten kicked out, gone home to Mississippi, I think, burned his house down, kept his wife and his mother-in-law in it when he did it, came back and he terrorized the base. And I mean terrorized the base. He was beating people up, raping women, and as I recall, there was one incident where he shot at a bunch of MPs. And it got so bad at one point, and I think it had to be after I came back from JAG school, so I'm going to say it was the summer of '68. They gave us orders to guard the officers' area. Jeffrey MacDonald lived there. I lived about 3 or 4 blocks away. These were square brick houses that captains and majors lived in, and they had a common backyard with swings and things like that. The MPs would patrol the front at night. And there would be a block commander, and you could go to the unit and pick up a 45 if you wanted to. There'd be 2 of you would be in the back to guard that. And I can remember my wife laughing when I had to do it. She would go from one window to the other watching me, and I could see the blinds going up and down. But I mean, you had written orders. If somebody came there and you told them to stop, and they showed any signs of not stopping or being adverse to your position, you had the right to shoot them. I mean, it was a Wild West scenario, and to my knowledge, they never caught the person that did that. It went on for months. And I can remember if I was going to go to your house for dinner, it got so bad that I would get dressed, my wife and I would get dressed. I would pick up my pistol, chamber around, walk out to the door, get in the car, put my pistol down, drive across base to your house, have dinner, and while I did, the pistol would be sitting there, and I'd get back in the car and drive back home. And I remember one time going through a roadblock of MPs, and they said they thought they'd seen this fellow. And I said, "Don't worry, I got a pistol right here." He said, "Well, keep your hands on it." And I drove home. But that was on base. And in Fayetteville, North Carolina, it was just Katie bar the door. The drug culture was unbelievable. My wife was from Mecklenburg County, Virginia, which is a rural county, and once we got set up with a house on base, I went up on a Friday, I remember it distinctly, and picked her up and came back because we were going to on Saturday. And it was our new home, and there was a knock on the door, and my wife went to the door, and there was an MP standing there. And he handed her a brochure. She said, "Thank you very much." She said, "No, ma'am, you're to read that in my presence." She said, "Okay." And it had a description of this fella, and it had nicknames he went by, and they thought they knew who it was. And they said, I remember she used to say, hides in places of darkness of the night or something on that order, and to be on the lookout for him and call the MPs if there was any problem. That was her introduction. She hadn't been at Fort Bragg an hour when that started. Scared her to death. This was the guy that was going around molesting women and things like that. What he would do, he would go up to, say, the 82nd, and the unit would have a jump schedule. So you'd find out that Company A was going to jump at 6 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. He would know who the commander of that unit was and where he lived, and he'd go to that guy's house, and when the commander went out the door, he'd go in the door. And that happened more than once. And I just remember we in the JAG Corps would talk to the MPs and CID, and we would hear the stories, and the stories were all over the post. It was a pretty scary time, and they never caught him. That I'm aware of, anyhow. Well, it's funny. To this day, I see things on TV about what they were doing in New England and New York and this, that, and the other. But at Fort Bragg, it was a totally different world. The country, they were having riots. I remember I was on alert teams to go to riots when they were burning down cities. There were violence everywhere. There was protests everywhere. Jane Fonda and her crew would come down and lead a protest rally. I saw that. It was just a time of upheaval. If you went off post not in Fayetteville, but in other areas with your uniform on. It never happened to me, but I had other people say they would almost get accosted because they were military officers. And it was just, you can't imagine I call it civilization, but it wasn't civil. It was going on in the United States in 1968, and the military took the brunt of it. The Cali My Lai massacre trial was going on. That was horrible publicity for the Army, and that was just a bad apple in the Army. That wasn't the Army. But that trial was going on. The Army was just getting it from every side. And people were coming to the Fort Bragg or Fayetteville area in order to damage the Army. I can remember as a JAG officer, I represented all sorts of people. And I represented one guy, and he basically told me that he had a whole box full of LSD on tabs hidden over somewhere. I said, you can't tell me that because that's a crime in the future or an ongoing crime. I represented you for whatever you did weeks ago. But he told me, I said, you tell me, I'm going to tell the MPs, which I did. He said, we know that stuff hidden over there, we just can't find it. But people were sending in drugs to Fort Bragg and the Fayetteville area that you just can't imagine today. Hard drugs. That I didn't get involved in, didn't know. Most of the stuff that I heard about was stuff that was coming in from outside, from New York, California, whatever else. I never heard of anything coming back from Vietnam. I heard of weapons coming back from Vietnam, but that's the only thing. It was violent, and it was kind of scary. You can't imagine what it's like to look on the TV and see Washington, D.C. or some other city, Baltimore, burning to the ground. I remember this always disappointed me, I didn't go, but I was the lead Jeep in the second plane when they took off from Fort Bragg, and they had the Corps Artillery and 82nd Airborne under 18th Airborne Corps to go to whatever city was having a riot, and we practiced to go. And when they actually did go, I happened to be in JAG school at the time, and I didn't make it, which I was disappointed about. But they actually sent troops from Fort Bragg, I think, to Baltimore and Washington, and they were there for weeks. Well, that Sharon Tate murder, that was unbelievable, and that was certainly in the headlines every day for a good while. I think that was the summer before this murder. I can't remember exactly when. I didn't pay that much attention to it, but I remember reading about it. Everybody did, and that was horrendous. And then the Manson tribe or cult or whatever you call them, they caught them and they tried them. And I did pay a little attention to that because as a lawyer it was kind of interesting what they were doing. And that gave you some idea of how crazy the society was at that time. I just happened to think one of the things I remember, I wasn't involved in it, but I knew all about it. At one point, they caught like 3 soldiers who went into an arms room in the 82nd Airborne, and they caught them carrying out a whole duffel bag full of M16s. Now, they caught them in the parking lot, so they never did anything. And another thing I remember, to give you some idea how wild and crazy it was, my house was in a residential area for officers, not a mile away, but adjoining it was a filling station and a small PX, a shopping center, where you went and had a bank. And I remember I don't know whether it was the summer of 69 or 70, but it was warm weather. A Jeep pulled in, and there were 3 soldiers in it, or people in uniform. They were not soldiers, as it turned out, with M16s. 2 of them got out and went in the back. The third one, who was driving the Jeep, sat there. 2 MPs came driving up, and I guess they were going to cash a check, and they stopped their Jeep and got out and started to walk in. The guy in the Jeep just took his M16 and cut them down in the parking lot. They were robbing the bank. And these people had stolen the M16s, stolen the Jeep, and stolen the uniforms. And they caught one of them at a later time, and he was not a soldier. But it was just the Wild West. It really was. It was. It would have been when I got up that morning and went to the office and at 18th Airborne Corps, we would have known about it as soon as it was reported, at least the JAG office would. I heard about it that morning and heard about it all day and called back and told my wife. And to give you an idea of what I thought that day, and I wasn't the only one, our house had a front door and a side door, and the side door came in on a little carport which was enclosed, and it had glass windows with frames at the top half of it. That night, to give you some idea, I rigged pots and pans so that if you opened that back door, even though it was locked, all the pots and pans in the kitchen would fall down and make a lot of noise. I mean, I had no doubt in my mind that could happen at Fort Bragg, and I'd heard the full story by that time. In the beginning, of just that it happened. And in the beginning, I heard Jeffrey MacDonald's story. After a few days, I began to hear that the CID or the MPs didn't believe his story and discounted everything he said and went off on their own scenario. I didn't know. I had gone to Fort Bragg in December of 67. And at the same time, there were 2 other JAG officers that were assigned there. And then in December of, I guess it was December of 69, they sent one of them, Bill Thompson, to the 82nd. They had a separate courts-martial jurisdiction. And they sent me to JFK Center. And we were both told we were probably going to go to Vietnam, so we were sending us over there, and new JAG officers were coming in. And Bill more than I, really had more experience trying court-martial cases than anybody else on the post. Nobody at JFK had any experience trying court-martial cases. I only did because I'd been up at Corps. And so we kind of figured if they didn't bring in somebody from outside, they'd probably get us. And we were right. And so we kind of acted accordingly, because we wanted the case, whether it was prosecution or defense. We didn't have any. I guessed if I were involved, it'd probably be defense, but I didn't know. And Bill being at the 82nd, he was totally out of the court-martial jurisdiction, except he was on the same post. And he didn't know what he would be. Everybody was talking about the case at all times. And the JAG office was getting reports, and we were paying attention to what the CID said, the MPs, and we were gossiping, for want of a better term, about the case. After a period of time, I was told almost surreptitiously that I was going to be assigned to represent Jeffrey MacDonald. Well, then I really started paying attention. And I did have friends in the CID, in the MPs, and I didn't pump them for information, but my ears were certainly open when I would see them. And you have to realize that at 18th Corps, they did all the prosecution for the JFK Center and everything else, and that was a very, very, maybe the busiest court-martial jurisdiction in the Army. And so the CID, the MPs, the investigators were always up there, and they were used to us, just like, because we did both prosecution and defense, and so we would talk back and forth, what's the latest on this, that, and the other. I really started to learn that after a week or 10 days, it appeared that the Army was going in one direction completely. I was on TV, they were looking at everybody, but in actuality, they were only looking at MacDonald. And that was pretty evident from what we saw that they were doing and what we actually heard on the ground. And that never changed till this day that I'm aware of. We discussed it again just over a cup of coffee of the JAG officers, and we assumed it was because, 1, he was there, 2, he was alive, and 3, he was a family member. And I'm not sure they were smart enough to look outside the room. They didn't believe anything he said, and never did. And from my estimation, he only looked at the evidence superficially, and he looked at it from one perspective. This went on for a couple of weeks, and I think the murder was February the 17th, because I just looked it up. I couldn't have told you a week ago. Throughout March, for want of a better term, they were going back and forth and back and forth. And I heard sometime in early March that I would probably be defending Jeffrey. I heard they were going to charge him in the first week of April, I think. I think it's about the first week of April they were going to charge him, and that I was going to be assigned his defense counsel. What they did in the Army is if somebody was charged with a crime, they assigned a defense counsel. They assigned a prosecutor and a defense counsel. I was going to be the assigned military defense counsel. And I'd already known that was going to happen. But I heard that about the first week of April, and I think I found out one day, and then there was an appointment set up for him to come in and meet with me the next day, and I remember that very clearly. Well, at first I was a little nervous because I didn't know what I was meeting, and I'd done nothing but read about this in the newspaper for weeks, and I didn't know what kind of client I had, but I was determined to represent my client as best I could. And at that time I was a little paranoid, and I took him and the Air Force Blue Angels or whatever they are was at Pope Air Force Base, and we went down to Pope Air Force Base because I wanted somewhere private to talk to him. I wanted to find out what he knew, what he said, and what he was like. We spent the whole day watching planes and talking, and I started to formulate my idea of what had happened and my ideas about him at that time. I liked him. He was a very nice person. He was easy to talk to. He was affable. He was kind of gullible. He was pretty naive, to be perfectly honest. I don't think he realized that the military had been going after him for the last month or so. I don't think he had any idea. And he didn't hide anything from me. He never did. And I like that. If I asked him a question, I got an answer. It was an honest answer, and if later in the conversation he remembered something else or contradicted himself, he did that, and I like that very much. As an attorney, well, the worst thing you can have is an innocent client, because then you really worry that you'll mess it up. But as an attorney, you want your client to tell you everything there is. If a client won't tell you, you have an almost impossible time putting together a case. That's right. Well, is after I was told, let me explain for a second. Court-martial jurisdiction to Fort Bragg, 18th Airborne Corps was the headquarters of the post, and they had general court-martial jurisdiction. The JFK Center was an independent command under CONARC, but for court-martial purposes, we went to 18th Corps. We couldn't convene a court-martial ourselves. We would go to Corps. I had been at Corps. I knew all the parties involved. I was told a couple of weeks before he was charged, as I recall, that I was probably going to be assigned to defend him. And after that, I began to feel like I was looking over my shoulder because I was concerned about the CID or somebody else watching over me, especially when I got named as counsel and it came out. No, I've never seen it used in any other situation, but you've got to realize this case, as we used to say, I would go home every afternoon and turn on Walter Cronkite and see what I did that day. And, my fish tank, and actually Jeffrey's fish tank was famous. It was on Walter Cronkite 3 or 4 times with the fish going back and forth and as they talked. But this case had so much publicity. It had everything. It had Ivy League school, doctor, Green Beret, wife and children homicide, Fort Bragg, you name it, it had it. And it was on the headlines every day, on the TV and in the newspaper. And the pressure was on the Army to perform, and on the CID and the prosecutors to perform. And I didn't trust everybody I should have trusted that I was right. Well, they weren't that young. The chief investigators, I was old. I was 28. I was old at Fort Bragg, seriously. But the CID officers the senior ones were my age or better. And they were professionals, and they'd been in there. They weren't very professional in the way they acted, in my opinion. They weren't very competent in how they did things. But they needed to investigate this case, and they didn't need to lose it. And they didn't need to have anything come out that was adverse to the Army. Now, I'm talking about the investigators and the MPs and the CID. I'm not talking about the commanding general or the command of General Tolson at 18th Corps or General Flanagan at JFK Center and the people that they worked with. That's a different deal. All they wanted was it done right. Army had taken some terrible black eyes, and I'm sure that the commanding generals said, do this and do it right and don't get us any black eyes, which is not what they did. But again, I repeat, the generals who commanded everything, from my point of view, acted appropriately and stayed out of it to the extent they could and only got involved to the extent they were supposed to. His story is the story that everybody's come to know. He had gone to Hamlet, North Carolina, which is not too far from Fayetteville. It's down there where the racetrack was. I can't even remember the name of the other town, but he worked in the hospital there. And as I recall, he said he was an emergency room doctor. This was pretty standard fare for doctors, and he was not busy. So he just worked, I think, a midnight shift, but he had very little to do, so he got a full night's sleep. And he came home and did what else he did. He said his wife was, I don't know what subject she was taking, but she was going to night school. And she went to night school, so he was home babysitting. And she went to night school, and then it was a rainy, foggy night. It was the kind of night something like this would happen on, if you were going to put it. It was really a bad night. I remember it well. And she came home, and they watched a little TV, and she went to bed. He said he went in, and one of his daughters had gotten into bed with her and had wet the bed. She put her back in her bed. He went in the living room where they had a long, flat couch to sleep on the couch. At some time in the middle of the night, he woke up to the noise and confusion, and there was this group of people, there were 4 that he I will say identified, he described, and he fought with them. And then at a later time, he woke up and saw his children and his wife and tried to minister to them, and the next thing he knew, he was in the hospital. That's a quick summary of what he told me. Well, I've lived with that story for 48 years, and I haven't doubted it. I really didn't doubt him then. Let's put it this way. I was testing him because I wanted to know. I didn't know whether to doubt or not. And for the first few weeks, when I would talk to him, even though I didn't look like I was paying attention, I was, because I wanted to see if there was a crossed wire or there was something left out or things changed that were not normal to change. And I soon came to the point that I was testing what he said happened as opposed to what the CID said happened, and finding out that what he said made sense and worked out. What they said, in my opinion, didn't. And so I came to quickly knocked out anything he said. I don't remember when I first met him, but I met him and was with him off and on throughout the thing. I remember them both. And Mr. Kassab, during the hearing, spent a number of days in our office back. He was absolutely an advocate, and so she was too. How was he assigned? In the Army, a defendant had the right to request an attorney. I was the appointed counsel, and Jeffrey had the right to request an attorney. And I'd set up with a friend of mine, Bill Thompson, who was over the 82nd, to request him. And he and I had been at Fort Bragg for a couple of years. We were good friends, and he was, in all candor, probably the best trial lawyer at Fort Bragg, present company included. And we had talked back and forth. And well, at the last minute when they charged Jeff, they said he was not going to be available. And Jeff said, I've got this good friend who's smart as he can be, and named Mike Malley. Let's request him, and we did that. And for me, that was fine because I already knew we were going to have civilian counsel. I wanted somebody who was Jeff's confidant and friend to bolster him up. A new friend, for want of a better term, but I wasn't somebody that could help him out for what I knew he was going to be going through in the next 6 months. Mrs. MacDonald, had a friend named Mr. Stern, as I recall, who lived in New Hope, Pennsylvania. And she called him and said, what has happened to you? What do I do? And he said, I'll get you the best criminal lawyer in Philadelphia. And that's how they got Bernie. And they called Bernie and retained him. Bernie came down to Fort Bragg and met with me, and I remember that quite well. And fortunately, again, I really grew to like Bernie and respect him, and he was a very good trial attorney. Well, it was kind of interesting. I'd tried court-martial cases for a couple of years, and I'd had a couple of instances where I'd had civilian counsel. And I know this surprises you, but at 18th Corps, the prosecution and the defense attorneys did their best. Maybe we were young and maybe we didn't know what we were doing, but we did our best to fight for our clients. And I'm thinking of one case in particular, I'd had civilian counsel who just wasn't worth shooting. There was some civilian counsel that were really great that would come out there and try cases. Bernie and Dennis Eisman were flying into Raleigh, North Carolina, and I told them I'd meet them at the airport in Raleigh. And I wore my uniform, I remember, and drove up there to get them, and we sat down, and I was going to take them to Fort Bragg and show them around. And I didn't know what I was getting into. I had researched them as best I could. We didn't have the internet then, but I found out I still had friends that practiced law at different places. And I had a good opinion of Bernie's abilities. I didn't know Eisman. I didn't know him till I met him that day. And Bernie is very affable and very intelligent, and I immediately got along with him. And so it was a short period of time. The two of us got so we could work together and trust each other pretty quick. And I enjoyed working with him at all times. He's a good lawyer. Well, Mike and I, if you've ever been to a big law firm, you have a senior partner, and you hire some junior people to do all the work. Mike and I were the junior guys. And we were there at Fort Bragg. The good thing was we had Mike's brain, and we had my background, because I knew where everything was at Fort Bragg. The military had also provided us with a specialist who was a typist, so we had a clerk. They gave us an office in the same building where the hearing was going to be held, so we had a private office. And Mike and I did the investigation and prepared the case, for want of a better term, and gave it to Bernie, and then Bernie would say, well, do this or do this. He was the guiding hand on the strategy and the tactics, but Mike and I were the feet on the ground, and it worked very well. Because fortunately, everybody got along and everybody worked together. Well, I don't know how to directly respond. We needed to find out what happened. We tried to get, and we ultimately got, the witness statements and whatnot from the various MPs, and we tried to put together what happened. We were fortunate we had Jeff, and he could help us some. And then we tried to figure out how to investigate, and Jeff knew who the neighbors were, and he knew who his wife's friends were and things like that. So we started going around the neighborhood talking to people like that. We thought we didn't have the resources that the Army did. But I'm not sure the Army had any resources they used, to be perfectly frank with you. But we started investigating. One ploy we used, people loved to talk to us because they would get a little bit of gossip. And so they would talk to us. And I don't think Mike and I were very intimidating. And we put in, as I recall, there were two ads in the paper. One was for $5,000, and I thought we had another one where we gave our phone number and whatnot. And we had people that would write us sometimes crazy letters and sometimes information that would give us leads. And we met a lady that lived in the neighborhood. Can't remember her name as I recall it. I don't know. But she did something like she sold Tupperware or something like that. She knew everybody. So we gave her little bits of information. She'd go out and gossip with everybody. And he'd call us back up and say, go see Mrs. Smith at so-and-so. She might know something. and nobody was intimidated by her. And the other thing that was very helpful for us, nobody was intimidated by Mike and me. We did the best we could. We didn't know what was going on. And just by dumb luck, we would go to a witness and we would say, what happened? And they would tell us, and we would say, now when you said bear, did you mean B-E-A-R like an animal, or was it B-A-R-E like no clothes? And because we didn't know, we finally discovered, and somebody, I think more than one person told us, they came forth more with us than the MPs because we weren't trying to prove anything. We were not only not trying to prove anything, we were trying to be as clear as we possibly could, and we engendered trust. And we got a lot of information that way. And it actually was useful because we talked to witnesses that the CID never talked to, which was amazing to me. And we also talked to witnesses that they had talked to who they'd irritated the witnesses. I can remember. They misquoted a witness, and they would write up the statement, and we would have a statement from somebody from the CID and say, this is what CID said you said. I didn't say that. And they just were not very sophisticated, and it helped our investigation. I don't think they deviated from their immediate first thoughts. I don't think we had to try to figure out what happened. And it was very helpful. We would take what Jeffrey MacDonald told us and see if it could be true. They would never see if it would be true. And we discovered a lot, and some of it was very damning to their case. In our ignorance, we were fortunate in having to uncover the facts ourselves. One of the things I remember that was one of the highlights, if you want to know the truth, and I still look back with great pride, for want of a better term, the government had certain articles of faith. They had certain pieces of evidence that couldn't be overcome. And one of them is in the photograph of the living room where Jeffrey MacDonald was on a sofa. In front of him was a rectangular coffee table, and in the photographs it was laying on its side. It was top heavy. Underneath it were a bunch of magazines. And they put on a witness, and he testified that they were tried 1,000,000 times and it would never fall that way. It was too top heavy, blah, blah. And this was a great piece of evidence that showed that the whole scene was staged. And we couldn't figure that out to save our life. How could that have happened? Because we kind of believed him. And Mike Malley and I were looking at the photographs of the house. And I think it was a green shag rug on the living room floor. A rocking chair on a rug, it'll make indentures where the rocking chair went. If you take the chair and you sit it exactly where you normally have a rocking chair, you can see that that's where it sat, but in the pictures it was turned around sideways. And we figured, wait a minute, what happened is the coffee table hit the chair, spun the chair around, it stopped the momentum, the magazines fell, and the coffee table landed on top of them. And we did all of that theoretically, but we were sure we were correct. So we asked permission. We'd never been allowed to go in the Counsel scene of the crime. And we asked permission to go into the scene of the crime. And Mike and I told Bernie about this and said, Judge Rock, or I say Judge Rock, Colonel Rock, said, all right, we're going to go in there one afternoon at 1 o'clock, but I don't want any discussions while we're in there. If you have a question or a thing, just put it in writing. He tried to run a good show, and he really did. And we'll come back. So Bernie and I went in, and the first thing we did is go straight to that chair and turn it over, and there was an arm of the chair. It was a modern kind of chair, and there were like there were 3 dents in it, and 2 of the dents had furniture polish in it. One of the dents, the biggest one, didn't have any furniture polish in it. And if you looked at the table, there was a dent in the side of the table. We said, aha, this proves what we've said. And we got Colonel Rock and said, Colonel Rock, will you please come look at this? And we didn't argue, we just showed that, and we drew it off. We had taken a tape measure. So we did the length of the arm and where these dents were located. So we went back to the courtroom, and we told Colonel Rock that our theory was the table had hit the chair had stopped the momentum, the chair had spun around, and that's how everything got. You got to realize the CID had testified this was impossible over and over and over again. I don't know, a month later, something like that. Colonel Rock had a JAG officer, Ham Beal. He was a good lawyer. He came up to me, he said, now, Jim, you tell your people if they laugh, you're dead. Don't you laugh no matter what we say. You just stand there and you tell everybody here, what are you talking about, Ham? Don't say a word. So we all stood and Colonel Rock came in. He'd gone over there, put the chair where we said, put the table where it was, kicked the table the first time. It landed exactly like in the photograph. And we didn't laugh. And the funny thing about that was, later we went back, got back in the premises and we looked at the arm of that chair and there were like 7 or 8 dents on it. So the CID had gone back in there after Colonel Rock and tried it himself, which proved to me 2 things. 1, we were right. And 2, the CID never did it before we did it. I don't know if they ever tested it at all. I'm sure they did, but they never thought about hitting the chair. And that was a great revelation to us and took a lot of wind out of their sails. The other thing, which was very dramatic, at least for me, and it's always bothered me, of all the Army people involved in this thing, there was a specialist for Michael, who was without question the smartest, hardest working, intuitive policeman around. I think he was from New York, and I think he'd been a policeman before he came in the Army and came in to get experience. And he went to the scene and did everything correctly. He was the only one. But they got a call from the CID head or the MP headquarters for him to proceed. They were on patrol to that address. I think he was a passenger and somebody else was riding in a Jeep, and he called us a blue light. They didn't have a siren on, but they had a blue light on the Jeep. And they came up to the stoplight, which was in the middle of the night, was blinking orange. And they were going to turn down to the left to go to Counsel Drive. And there were some bushes over here. And this is where there was a filling station and a small shopping center. And he looked over in the bushes, and there was a girl hiding in the bushes with a floppy hat and a raincoat on. Well, that's kind of unusual at 3 o'clock in the morning in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the rain. I mean, it's very unusual. But he couldn't stop because he was on a code blue or whatever it was. So he went over there and he gave artificial respiration to Jeff, and he was the only one that did everything right. I mean, he really did. And when Jeff was removed, or when he got the story from Jeff about the description of the 4 intruders, one of them is exactly the description of the girl he had just seen 2 blocks away. And I mean 2 blocks on the way to the scene. And he told the lieutenant that. And then I don't think they sent anybody to hunt for. But he went back, I was told, to the office, and he filled out a witness statement. And he put that in the witness statement. They made him take it out of the witness statement, and the witness statement that we got didn't have that in there. So we went to the hearing, and we met with him, and he got a lot of information. And the last question Mike and I used to always ask, is there anything else you can think of that we hadn't asked you about that you would like to tell us about this? And everybody always said no, most of the time. Well, he did too. So he testified for the prosecution, and he never mentioned this girl, never mentioned it. Well, he was too good a man to let that pass. And I'm not sure how he got the word back to us, but he got the word back to us about what he had seen and the fact he'd been told not to testify to it. I think he was either our first or second witness we called, and the prosecution just went through the ceiling, we called it. We hadn't put him on the witness list. We said, he's your witness. We're just calling him back to the stand. When he testified, Colonel Rock didn't like that because Colonel Rock was a very honorable man. He really didn't like that. He said, well, Mike had testified about seeing this girl, and he testified that he'd been told not to tell anybody that. And Colonel Rock, I can't tell you what, if anything, he said, but I knew the look on his face. And I didn't want Colonel Rock mad at me, I promise you. I'll tell you what I told Bernie. He asked me that question. He said, just like his name, you can count on him. Peter built the church on a rock. When Colonel Rock was appointed, I knew him. How'd he do, sir? That's about it. But he'd been on court-martial panels. When a panel will sit for a number of court-martials, and when you get a new panel, you try to find out what you can about the people on there. If somebody's got a predilection in one direction, you want to know it before you try a case against them. And so we kind of knew he was a known entity to us. And he was known to be smart, honest, straightforward. And I remember telling Bernie, if I were a general, he'd be on my staff, and I'd do everything he said. And in fact, it was because he was the hearing officer, is one of the main reasons we decided to try the case in the 32, because we knew that General Flanagan appointing Colonel Rock, he wanted to know what happened. And Colonel Rock was going to find out what happened, and he was going to report back to Flanagan, and Flanagan was probably going to do what Colonel Rock said. And another, I'll pass, to give you some idea. We did statements. If I interviewed you, as soon as you left, you go out the door. Sometimes we'd have you on tape. Sometimes we wouldn't. We'd just be scribbling notes. Mike and I would both regurgitate every fact we could. He's got sandals on and no socks. Every fact we could possibly think of, we make little notes, just scribbles. And we gave these little summaries to Bernie Siegel so he would know who he was talking to, because Bernie hadn't interviewed any witnesses before they got on the stand. And I remember Bernie said, "Jim, you didn't give me anything on Colonel Rock, and he's the most important person in this." And I said, "I don't have to. His name is what he is. And I mean that in the highest esteem, And he was good. He ran a good show. I didn't know him as well as I did some other JAG officers because he hadn't been there that long, but he was a JAG officer from 18 Corps. He was a good lawyer, and he did a very fine job, I think, advising Colonel Rock. You've got to realize the position those two were in, and they ran a good show, and Ham Beal, I think, did a good job. Well, if you walked outside the hearing room, there were 6 or 8 newspaper reporters every day. If I went home in the evening and I turned on Walter Cronkite, I could see my office, and I could see me walking out of it. I mean, the attention of the public was trained on that hearing and on what was going on, and Colonel Rock and Ham Beal, as his attorney to assist him, wanted to do the best job they can. I mean, you're not going to find me saying anything bad about Colonel Rock, and I didn't beforehand, I promise you. Cliff was the chief prosecutor because he was still at 18th Corps, and Bill Thompson, who my friend, was the assistant. And they did all right. They worked hard, but Cliff was in charge, and he's a good lawyer. But I fought back and forth with him. He was hampered because I always thought he was hampered because his witnesses and the people he were talking to were not telling him what was right because either they were making it up, didn't know, or just flat stupid. Well, it's a preliminary hearing. Okay. Well, the Uniform Code of Military Justice sets forth how you proceed to charge somebody with a crime. And at that time, the Uniform Code of Military Justice was under a lot of strain. But it actually is a pretty good system. And for 99 times out of 100, it is run by officers who want to do the best they can and get to the bottom of things. What happens is there's a crime committed, or it can be a disciplinary offense, because the Uniform Code of Military Justice was discipline as well as crime. But there's an infraction, let's call it that. In order to court-martial somebody, you have to have an independent officer appointed to hear the evidence to make sure there's enough evidence to take it to a court-martial. And so usually it's pretty perfunctory. You go to the Article 32, you listen to the evidence, the defense doesn't say a word, and there's a report written by the 32 officer and it's sent up. In this case, we determined to try the case there. But it's just a preliminary hearing. It's just one step. And the 32 officer writes a written report, and he gives it to the court-martial convening authority with his recommendation. And the court-martial convening authority, in this case General Flanagan, can accept the report, and then he can take whatever action he wants to. He can dismiss the charges, which he did in this case, or he can refer the charges on to General Court-Martial. It's just a preliminary hearing, safety valve. I interviewed them. I don't remember, and they testified. I don't recall that. I mean, I remember them testifying. I remember interviewing them. I remember them testifying, just generally speaking in the normal course of things, but I don't recall interviewing them with Colonel Rock there as such, other than in the Article 32 hearing itself. It wasn't until Colonel Rock was appointed, and you got to realize it was based on his intelligence and integrity that we decided to try it completely. And in fact, if you may not remember, but we tried to have an open hearing where the public would be involved. That was denied to us, but because we wanted an open trial, we wanted to try the case. And I think it dawned on the prosecution. JFK Center is separate from 18th Corps, and JFK Center is going to do what JFK Center is going to do. Commanding General Flanagan is going to do what he's going to do, and he's going to try to do what was right just between you. I mean, he's going to stand up for his officer, but he's going to try to get to the bottom of any crime. It dawned on them, it dawned on the prosecution, if they didn't put on a complete and full case, Colonel Rock was going to rule. And it dawned on us the same way, and we had faith in his abilities, and I'm sure that Cliff Summers and Bill Thompson, in talking about Colonel Rock, had exactly the same opinion. Well, when we started investigating the crime scene, we had the advantage of Jeffrey MacDonald could write us a roadmap of where every piece of furniture was and this, that, and the other in there, even though early on we didn't have photographs, but we soon got them. And we started looking at the witness statements and hearing what the prosecutor, when we talked to the investigators, what they were basing their case on, and it was garbage. I mean, I talked about the table going over. That was a big deal for them. And it took us a while to refute that. Another thing they talked about was there was a white flower pot, and it was sitting up on the floor. And they said, see, that's a staged scene. It would never sit up. Well, we agreed. But we talked to some MPs and found somebody that said, yeah, I picked it up and put it over here. And they never, I don't think they interviewed everybody that went in the house. I don't think we ever interviewed everybody that went in the house because we couldn't find out who everybody was. Every time we would talk to somebody, we'd get them to list everybody else that they saw in the house. But there was at least one person that nobody ever knew who they were. And the flower pot was a glaring example of evidence they thought was important. We had a witness that said, no, I picked it up. It was laying on its side. The table was another one. There were just things like that. Jeffrey MacDonald's wallet, he didn't have much money in it, but 2 or 3 investigating MPs saw it sitting on a table or whatever it was sitting on. It disappeared. He later found out that one of the ambulance drivers stole the wallet from the crime scene, took the money out of it and threw it away. And somebody found it and turned it over to the commanding officer. And it became obvious to us that the crime scene was a circus. And the only person that was not a clown in that circus was Micah. Some of the other MPs did the best they could and whatnot. But Micah was the only one that was in charge of anything. The rest of them just stomped around and had conflicting stories. It was amazing how they would conflict in details that normally wouldn't be important, but in a crime scene like that were important. Was he the guy that came to pronounce him dead? Okay. I mean, the name is vaguely familiar. There was a great to-do about, especially Jeff's wife Colette's body, and the fact of where it was positioned and where he was and whether she was covered or not. They took photographs, but when we talked to the MPs and the various people that were in the place, they would say, I came in and the body was, I'll put it this way, pointing due north. And the photographs showed him pointing west. Well, then Neil came in and said he turned them over and turned them back over. We had other people that came in and said, I saw Colette's stomach exposed. The CID said, oh no, she was covered with a cloth. Well, yes, she was covered with a cloth later by somebody who was trying to be polite. I can't remember who, but we determined that the crime scene had been, amongst those 15 or so people that probably went in there, the crime scene had been altered. And you really had a very, very difficult, if not almost impossible task to reconstruct the crime scene unless you went back to the original testimony by the original MPs, and some of them did give pretty good testimony. Yeah, vaguely, but we were trying to make sense out of the photographs. And as I say, they didn't necessarily jive. It became, the more we looked at it, the more we were not making fun of, but we were appalled by the investigation and the evidence that they put forth. The only thing to do was to go after that evidence because it was so shocking. If they were going to base their evidence on something that was, you could tear down, and you could tear down with the rest of their evidence and the testimony of the people who had actually done it, that was the way to fight that case. And we did. They were dramatic, and Micah was dramatic, but I think it was just layer on layer of refuting the prosecution's evidence. We had one situation, and I shouldn't smile, but we had a good time doing some of this stuff. The government put somebody on as a witness, and as I recall, I think he was the coroner for Baltimore, Maryland. And he got on the witness stand, and he testified that Jeffrey MacDonald had received injuries which could only be superficial and never would have hurt anybody, and he was stabbed exactly where it wouldn't hurt him, and he went on and on. This is the most damning testimony we ever heard. But as he testified, he kept pointing like this. And we sat there, and the rules were that only one person was designated to try the case, and Bernie was trying the case for us. The rest of us would sit back there and think, hopefully. We kept looking at that, and Bernie, I remember turning around and saying, let's stretch this out till lunchtime. We stretched out the cross-examination till lunchtime and then asked Colonel Rock if we could go to lunch, and we had to meet with somebody, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock. We ran out of the place and got a medical book, and this is what a lawyer does if you're ever on a jury. We asked the doctor all the questions, I won't say in Latin, but in medical terms. where was the wound in the seventh, I remember, if I'm not mistaken, the seventh intercostal space? He said yes. That was all we needed, because that's where they put a tube in to take the fluid off the lung, or the air off the lung. So what he thought was the wound was what had been done in the hospital. So we just led him right down the path, and we said, would you like to see MacDonald? You've never seen him. And we pulled up the medical records, and that was pretty dramatic because it just wiped out everything he had done, and it also wiped out a lot of the credibility of the prosecution to put somebody on that would testify that way. That's correct, yeah. It proved that he had inflicted wounds that that a doctor would know were not serious wounds, and we basically turned that on his head, as I recall. I remember the name, but I can't tell you what he testified. Okay, he was backing up our contention that the wounds that the evidence came in that the wound that Jeffrey MacDonald suffered was in an area that it could have easily, by going left or right just a little bit, have punctured some vital organ, and it would have been a very serious, if not fatal, injury. And that's the testimony. I remember it was Jacobson that did it, but I remember we got that evidence in. I don't remember specifically. He had, I'm subconsciously looking at the left. He had wounds, I think, to the chest, and that's all I can tell you. I mean, it's been so long since I've looked at him. He was hard fought, but all the way along, we felt we were doing well with the evidence, and part of that was probably because we had such contempt for some of the investigators. We didn't believe them. I should admit that. But once we got further down the line and we were able to disprove some of the things that the prosecution had relied on so heavily, the case at that time was not as sophisticated as it could have been. It's not as sophisticated as it would be today because we didn't have DNA and we didn't have all that. But once we started to cut the feet out from under them, we began to feel pretty good. And we began to, not that Colonel Rock would indicate which way he was going, but you can tell what somebody's thinking by the questions they ask. And he would ask questions and request this, that, and the other from us. I remember that usually psychological testimony comes in to prove somebody's crazy. We wanted to bring it in to prove he was not crazy. And we wanted to have the evidence come into the record. And what Colonel Rock did is say, okay, but if you're going to put in that evidence, then I want him examined by an Army doctor. And so we agreed, and we went to Walter Reed Army Hospital. We went, Jeff and an escort officer. Now, Jeff had to have an escort officer everywhere he went. Stayed at the Walter Reed Inn and went over and met with a Dr. Bailey. He was a major or lieutenant colonel, I don't know. And we talked and entered into an agreement with him. I came to really respect him. He was good. He was, quote, the Army's guy, but the agreement was that Jeff would absolutely, totally cooperate with him. But anything that he said that was factual would not be divulged to the prosecution or anybody else. In other words, if he said it was 2 a.m, he wouldn't divulge it. Jeffrey said it was 2 a.m. But he would use that fact, and he might be able to say, Jeffrey said it was a certain time, but that wouldn't help the prosecution. So Jeffrey was free to be open with him, and he was, because I would go in there, I would take Jeffrey in there in the morning, and they would call me, and I'd go pick him up in the afternoon, because he was not supposed to be out, although he was out at night drinking. He didn't drink, but the escort officer and I did. But I could tell the sessions were going well because Dr. Bailey, and I'm sure that was his name, he didn't have any more. He would say, we're coming along fine. I'd like to spend another day and do this. And the only thing that we refused to do, and he didn't disagree, he agreed, he said, would you let him take sodium amythol, I think it was. And we said, no, I don't want him to relive that experience. And Jeffrey's pretty anti-drug anyhow, to say the least. And Dr. Bailey said, I agree. I'll just ask you the question. We got along well with him. He was very good. In fact, when he came down to testify, as I recall, he called up and came over and had a beer before we went over to see the Army people. But he was very good and very thorough. Once we stayed in New Hope, Pennsylvania for about a week, and Dr. Sadolph's office was Doylestown. I thought that was my Revolutionary War. Doylestown, okay, it's somewhere up north of Philadelphia, I don't know. And we went over and I met him. Surprisingly enough, I didn't have half the FaceTime with him, I guess because Bernie and them knew him, that I did with the Army doctor. But he did complete testing, and they both basically came to the same conclusion. They didn't differ very much. Well, yeah, I'm not sure that I remember it being very dramatic, because I think by the time, as you say, they knew Sadolph we wouldn't put him on if he wasn't going to say what we wanted him. And by the time that the prosecution had to put their doctor on, who was, I guess, chief of psychiatry at Walter Reed. I don't know. He was up at Walter Reed, was the hospital. They knew what he was going to say. And so they didn't want to highlight what he was going to say because he wasn't going to say anything that was bad about Jeffrey. He didn't. He wouldn't say Jeffrey didn't do it, but he did say basically, I shouldn't be quoted, but that he didn't think he was capable of doing it or something to that effect. And that's been a long time ago, so I may be fudging a little bit. It was, and but it had to be done. We were trying our case then. And as I recall, we talked about it. One person, Bernie, who was by far the best trial lawyer going, had to present our side of the case, and one person had to present the government side of the case, unless there was somebody was out of town or something like that. So we had to designate. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure I did, and I think Michael O'Malley did. When Jeff got on the stand, we left the room, as I recall. And the idea was, I'd been with him for months, every day, and we've become friends. I'd been the lawyer that was defending him. And we didn't want him to be able to turn over and look and see somebody had been defending him all the time. We wanted him on the stand by himself. We wanted him to be vulnerable. I know that sounds funny, but we did. And I left. I didn't see him testify. I hear he did a very good job, But again, I didn't watch it. I mean, Bernie and them said he did a fine job. I guess I read the transcript, but I'm not sure. At that time, I was kind of the opinion that unless he really goofed up on the stand, that we put on a good case. And I think he put on a good case, and I didn't think he was going to be caught up in any cross-examination by Cliff Summers. I really didn't. A month, 6 weeks, it took a while. A little tense. We were just waiting, but it didn't surprise me because I knew that they were going to collate, coordinate all the evidence and look at it and go over it and over it. Colonel Rock had been given a job that was the headlines of every paper, and he was going to get it right. And so that didn't surprise me. We kind of heard it was coming down, and every now and then we'd get a whiff of what was going to happen, but we didn't know. No, we would just, if I saw Ham Beal walking down the street or something, hey, Ham, how you doing? He might say, oh, doing fine, Jim, but he was openly friendly and nothing improper in any way. We knew they were working hard on it, and all we could do was sit and wait, and we did. He did that. In the closed hearing room, he was pretty definite on. He had, for want of a better term, had gone along with what we said, and he said it ought to be investigated. And I think that was probably why it took him a long time. He was going through making up his mind, and I remember him. It's kind of funny. I remember him saying that, but the bottom line is what we were waiting for, and that's what I was waiting for, which was he's recommending the charges be dismissed. And I knew if he recommended that to General Flanagan was going to. And I'm told through the grapevine that he and General Flanagan had a long discussion. Colonel Rock did his report, got everything up, and then he reported to General Flanagan. That was not what a lot of Army people wanted to hear. But again, they followed what they felt the evidence was. Well, yeah, Helena was kind of interesting. Well, we were, it's unusual that you would try to point out not only that somebody else did it, but who that person was when nobody else knew it. I can't remember how we came upon a guy named Posey, but somehow or another we came upon him, and you've got to realize that people were sending us letters and calling us on the phone, and some of them were crazy, and some of them were right on the money and were trying to be as helpful as they could. Somehow we got Posey. And he told us that he lived next. What is it? Well, I bet it's that's one of those damn stink bugs. Damn stink bugs coming down. All right.
Like 4 pieces.
Don't pick him up because they call them stink bugs for a reason.
Oh, is that what I do? I'm making a stick.
Yeah. But, all right, I'm gonna go back. Somehow or another. I don't recall how Posey contacted us, but as my recollection is he contacted us. We talked to him, and he basically said to begin with that he had this neighbor that was strange to say the least, and that on the night that all this happened, he saw her come in the middle of the night in a Mustang convertible, I think, a Mustang car anyhow, and that she had a hat and boots and wore them quite a bit and a long blonde wig. So she met the description, and he said that she was involved with these people that were strange, and they were the wildest hippies around, and they were big on drugs. And so we started following up on this and trying to find out who she was. And she was a daughter of an active duty colonel, lieutenant colonel, I think. She wasn't that old. She was about 17 or 18, something like that. And we tried to find out who her friends were and what she'd done, because the more we looked at it, somebody else told us that she hadn't 100% admitted it, but she had talked about this thing. And she talked about it to neighbors, and on the day of the funeral, Jeff's wife and children, that she sat out with some black flags or something like that. It's a strange. Jeff had a set-to the day before the murders took place with some hippies downtown, and we wondered if this were tied together. And you got to realize that the hippie community in Fayetteville was so strange I can't even begin to describe it to you. The more we investigated her, the more we found corroborated. And it ultimately got to the point, and I may be getting past the 32, where she had admitted to people she'd done this. And she also was a drug informant for the Fayetteville Sheriff's Department, Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. And the more we looked at it, the more we thought she actually did it. And we found people that had, in the neighborhood, that had corroborated to our satisfaction. Helena, yeah, she had told other people that she'd been involved and she had been there. She didn't say she did it, she said she had been there. She seemed to know too much about it. And we found people in the immediate neighborhood that had seen a group of people that were hippies in the neighborhood, so there was some corroboration in our mind. And we finally figured out she was the one. And she ran around with a group of people that met the description, and especially with her blonde wig and her floppy hat and her boots and all that she apparently wore all the time. She fit the description of the person that Jeffrey MacDonald described and Micah described. I can't remember how we got the evidence in there. I guess it was Posey we put on the stand. He testified that he'd seen him come back. That's exactly right. It's been so long I can't. But you got to prompt me, because I guess we put Posey on, and he testified about what he knew about her strange doings, and not only before the incident took place, and how I think he moved. If I'm not mistaken, he was scared enough he and his wife moved, but that he saw him in the early morning hours coming back in to her place, and then later her strange activities around the funeral, and she didn't testify. She would not testify, and I don't think would talk to us at that time. Later, she did, after the Article 32, they did talk to her, and I'm advised, I wasn't there, but I'm advised she admitted to a number of different people. And I thought, and I mentioned earlier, I remembered, maybe I was wrong, that she knew things that were in the house that other people, that I didn't know. And I had studied whatever photographs I could, but I didn't know there was a hobby horse in the house. And then she testified later, or she said, that the phone rang in the middle of all this, and they found somebody who corroborated that. And she said she brushed her hair with a hairbrush, her wig with a hairbrush, and they found long, blonde, synthetic hairs in that hairbrush. And they didn't, to my knowledge, match anything in the house. So you could, to a certain degree, physically put her in that location. Okay, I may too. You didn't think I could stand up, did you? I didn't think I could stand up. It's the fact that my knees don't work anymore.
We good?
It comes from being old. That's a V8 Aston Martin. That's down at the VIR. Well, it's actually a couple of them. We bought like,
I know.
but it was all rotted out and rusted
really?
out. It needed to be. The walker panels were gone. I took it completely down and took it to a restoration shop, and they did the body. And then when they brought it back, I put it together. I don't have as much in it as you think. I think. Yeah, and I had a friend of mine that was an upholsterer, and he was really super. He was really good. No, we asked him would he. No, when the coroner from Baltimore was testifying, we asked him if he had ever examined Jeffrey MacDonald. He said no, he hadn't. I said, would you like to examine him? No, that's okay. I don't need to. Okay, that's my recollection. I know he never examined him. And then we put Jeff on. we showed him, we had the medical records, we had them all marked and everything and put them in, and he felt rather foolish. General Flanagan dismissed the charges, and they gave Jeff the option he could either stay in the Army or he could get out with an honorable discharge. By that time, he decided to get out, and he left Fort Bragg, I'll tell you, in December of 1970. And the case was basically over. Every now and then I would get a call from the CID or somebody about one or two things. But not very often. It was over by the end of the year. And Jeff moved to California. He got hopefully on with his life. The CID and the FBI and whatnot, mostly the CID, kept investigating the case, trying to prove he did it. By that time, they were really mad at us. And I understand why. I think they came down to cover their tail, just to be perfectly honest with you. Mike Malley was going to Vietnam, and I hadn't seen what he wrote since he wrote it, but he had a couple of pages of allegations which I thought were true, and he sent them to General Tolson, who was a 3-star commanding general of 18th Airborne Corps. He was a court-martial convening authority, is a proper way to make a complaint, and he copied me on it, and I wrote a letter to General Tolson just saying I had information that I would be happy to provide anybody investigating the investigation or anything else, just saying I was prepared to come forward with whatever I knew. Later, within a month or two, I was asked to talk to some CID officers, and I remember doing it over, if not the same building, close to where the BOQ, where Jeff was. And they had a room much smaller than this room, and I was interviewed by 2 CID officers, and you had a transcript of an interview by me, which I had never seen before. Never seen the transcript. It's got a lot of misspellings and a lot of typos and whatnot. When they were interviewing me, I remember looking down, and there were air ducts between the rooms, and I could see that the air duct was stuffed closed, so there wouldn't be any sound coming in, so I knew they were taping me. There wasn't any doubt in my mind. And the funny thing was, they didn't like what I was saying. And every now and then they try to lead me. And you don't have half the transcript. You don't have a lot of the stuff I said. Because I remember one way that it ended, the 2 guys were sitting to my left, one almost in front of me and one to my left. And there was a specialist sitting over here. And he looked like all specialists who'd been drafted and was waiting to get out. And they were asking me, trying to get me to say that we'd done something nefarious in our investigation or this, that, and the other, which was not true and I wasn't going to say. I basically said one of the reasons we got the information we got is when the CID would interview us, the sergeant or the specialist who'd be sitting there would see what they were doing and make him so mad that after the interview he'd call me up and tell me what was going on. And they looked over to the specialist and he was about to give me a call and they terminated the interview. But they were interviewing. I had authority, and it was proper for me to meet with them. But they were not investigating the investigation, in my opinion at least. No, they never closed the investigation. And I think they continued on. But maybe they just started the investigation after General Flanagan dismissed the charges, because they kept going. In 1970 or whatever it was, they brought the charges against Jeff. But they just never quit. And I don't think they ever tried to get information that would exonerate him or follow up on the stuff we had said. Because the little things we picked up, I'd be talking to Mike Malley or I'd be talking to Bernie Siegel at a later time. And the feedback we would get, they weren't doing anything. And again, I was at Fort Bragg for almost another year after that. Yeah, he's a good lawyer. Probably. The CID wanted to accuse us of dirty pool. To my knowledge, we didn't play any dirty pool. We just went out to investigate and do the best we can. There was amazing friction. And part of it, I think, is the CID just were in over their head. I mean, as I pointed out before, the only outstanding investigator I saw was Micah. He did everything correctly. And I think I said earlier that Cliff Summers, I think, labored under the problem that his evidence providers were not that good. You can't make a case out of nothing. And they never did investigate it, in my opinion. I don't think they did expect us to go after them in the 32. I think we basically said we were, but I don't think they took us at our word. And I don't think they had any inkling that we could disprove a lot of the things they said or prove other facts ourselves. And I think that caught them off guard a little bit. because 32s usually are pretty perfunctory. It kind of appeared that way because they just didn't have a command. I was surprised that we knew more than they did, I think. And you would have thought we wouldn't have the ability to find it out, but we did. I had no other duties, and Mike Malley had no other duties. That's all we did. But I think Summers and Bill Thompson. But it's interesting, Bill Thompson, who's unfortunately deceased now, when Jeff got convicted down in North Carolina, he called me and he said, "Jim, I don't believe this. There's not enough evidence to convict him. I tried to." He said, "What?" He and I were friends. I mean, we got back together and were good friends afterwards. There was, to a certain extent, I did, but not to the extent that I could have. I think that I was kind of amazed that the lab either couldn't or didn't perform in a timely fashion or in a efficient fashion, because I think I mentioned, and my numbers are wrong, but let's say that when they went through the house, they found 200 identifiable palm and fingerprints. And you'd put dust on them and you'd put tape on them, and then you'd lift the prints. Well, when they did that, they ruined about half of them when they lifted them, and they neglected to take a photograph of them before they lifted them. So let's say if it was 200, now they had 100 left. And of that 100, they never identified half of them. And I thought to myself, that's basic. Why in the world do you not take a photograph of them before you try to lift the print off the wall? I mean, they did stupid things like that. They ruined more evidence you'd ever know. And then they would try to cover that up. And the fingerprints, I remember determining what they'd done. But the labs just didn't seem to have a clue of what was going on. If the FBI had investigated it, it would have been a different ball of wax. In my opinion, the FBI would have investigated it thoroughly and come up with their own conclusions. And if they felt Jeff was innocent, they would have said it. And if they felt he was guilty, they would have said it. This is about 3:30 in the morning on the 17th morning of the 17th of February. I think they walked in the door. They said he did it, and they never looked back. I don't think they ever tried to figure out what was going on. But as I say, to this day, I bet you can't find a list of the people that were in the house that night. I bet you can't find witness statements from all this. They just did one thing and one thing only. And they didn't try. We tried to see if what Jeffrey said was correct. And most of the time when we did, it was proved to be correct or possible, like on the table. They just never did. I'm just amazed. I mean, they should have investigated everything on both sides. Yeah, bigly. Yeah. Well, this was more than soiled because I don't know how many witnesses said that a shaggy rug or whatever it was moved and put over the body, and everything was changed around. And once you do that, it's almost impossible to undo it. You can't do it. And I don't know why I can't believe they just didn't seal the house off and let the investigators in. The investigators, as I recall, testified contrary to each other on a number of different things, and didn't get up there and say, well, so-and-so will say this, but I think this. That would have quelled the issue a little bit, but they didn't. Yeah, I don't remember but one. I remember one day, it may have been more than once, but I remember one in particular. I'm sure that's who I was talking to. I have no idea. But I remember there were CID officers who I did not know, and they had a room in the BOQ, as I recall, and they had equipment and this, that, and the other. And I talked to them and told them what they didn't want to hear. I was careful. I was talking to them mostly about the CID and not about Jeffrey. I had permission to do that from the Army and from Jeffrey. And I was basically backing up Mike Malley's allegations. That was the last I ever heard of it. And I'm sure it was the last anybody ever heard of it. There was a couple of years later, I got a call from Bernie, and he had said they were going to reinstigate the case and prosecute. And Bernie had filed I don't know if it was an appeal, I don't know how, a motion or something to dismiss based on double jeopardy. And we talked about that. And I remember that went all the way to the Supreme Court. I remember he had asked me to come sit with him in the Supreme Court. And two things happened. One, it was about a 20-inch snow that day. And two, I had a hearing that I had to get back more. But that was in the 70s. And I can't give you a date. And Bernie and them took care of that. I mean, I talked to him on the phone, but I was not responsible for any of that. And then he came back down and they got ready for trial and head to trial. I went down, my wife and I drove down, her mother's house was not far from Raleigh. We used to go down there all the time, so we went down and told them we were coming, and it was the weekend that Helena Stokely was coming up there. And we drove down and got there early in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning or something, spent the day with them and saw everybody. I guess I talked business 20 minutes. And Bernie and I went out to lunch and talked about things, but it was mostly social. I had talked back and forth occasionally, but not in any great extent if they needed anything I had. I remember what was interesting. I had, of all things, a witness from Roanoke, Virginia. There was a warrant officer who lived right over from Jeffrey's house, who was from Roanoke, Virginia. And the night in question, I remember him telling me, he was doing a model airplane or a model boat or something, and he had the windows open so the fumes would go out. And he heard people, and he looked out the window and he saw this weird group of people heading towards Jeffrey's house. It was the middle of the night. He went on to bed and then woke up the next morning and everything had happened. He never told anybody, but he had a brother who was a lawyer with Hunt and Williams in Richmond. He drove to Richmond, he told me later, and gave us a complete sworn statement because he was concerned they would hold him over, and he was ready to get out of the Army. Nobody knew this, and a year or two later, I was at the Commonwealth's Attorney's office here in Roanoke, and that's where the bar library was. And you went into the bar library through their office. And the secretary came in and said, "Hey, my husband was at Fort Bragg, and she told me that story." And that's where we found him out. And so we had a witness put in a group going to Jeffries, and I had told Bernie, and they must have listed him as a witness because an FBI agent came up here to interview him. And we went out to a motel, I forget where, and I sat there as the attorney. I didn't say anything, and he interviewed him at some length. And then the witness left, and the FBI agent and I had lunch. And the FBI agent was a pretty good guy. And he told me at that time that we were losing the case and that Bernie seemed not to get along very well with the judge and seemed tired. Was what? Okay. This was just sheer happenstance. I was up researching something, and his wife, who worked in the Commonwealth Attorney's office, came in and said, "We were at Fort Bragg when you were there." Just amazing, yeah. But that's what, this case is so famous. People come up and tell you things like that, and they did that when I was at Fort Bragg. If they knew something, they would tell you. I don't know any of that, Yeah, that's exactly what he said. Milne, that's his name. His mother worked for Hieronymus because a friend of mine owned Hieronymus. I think that's right, anyhow. Roanoke is a small town. As I say, the bar library was in a room adjacent to the Commonwealth's Attorney's office, and you went through the Commonwealth's Attorney's office to go in there, and they had treatises that the law firms didn't have. And I was just happened to be up there one day, as lots of lawyers did, researching something. And Milne's wife came in and said, "Hi, I don't know you, but I knew a lot of them up there. And we were at Fort Bragg when you were trying that case," and she told me the story. And I was interested. I chatted with her. And so a year or two later, when it came back, I called Bernie and told him. I said, "You don't believe it, I got a witness for you. I can find out who he is." I hadn't met him at the time. I don't think I met him until the FBI came up to interview him. He seemed pretty normal to me. I think he was a helicopter pilot. And I only met him one time, as I recall, with the FBI agent. We sat in a room, and the FBI agent interviewed him and did a very good job, thorough, balanced job. And I remember he went on off, and the FBI agent and I had lunch, and he brought me up to date on everything that was going on in the trial. And I called Bernie and told him basically what I'm telling you, what he said. As I recall, he said there was a cul-de-sac, and if I'm standing looking at the end of the cul-de-sac, Jeffrey's house was on the left-hand side. It was an apartment house. And at the end of the cul-de-sac, there was an apartment house, and behind that was the main highway. And this guy had been to Vietnam, had come back, was getting ready to get out of the Army in a month or two. And his hobby was making models, I guess planes and boats, I have no idea. And he was up, and he, I think, painted or worked on this model. And they had a bedroom that he worked in. The glue smelled real bad, so he had the windows open. It was a cold night, but he had the windows open. They'll leave a message. They'll know we're here, I think. I don't know, this is a... What is it? What is it? I couldn't understand a word he said. I didn't... Good move. Well done. I've forgotten where. I have no idea who or what that was. But he was up in his in a bedroom, and whatever model he was working on, he'd finished it or just about to finish it, and had painted it, and the paint smelled. And so he opened the windows on the corner. And when he opened the windows, he thought he heard something. He looked outside, and he saw 3 or 4 people. I remembered him saying, like, in choir robes or robes you'd wear when you graduate or something like that, but they didn't have on a shirt. And they had candles, and they went by his house, and I think he walked to the other window, and they watched him go over towards MacDonald's. He said, "That's strange, but this is Fort Bragg, so you never know." He went on to bed, and then the next morning he heard about that, but he didn't want to testify because he'd have been put on hold, and he'd still be at Fort Bragg. Now, as I recall, he said that his brother was a lawyer with Hunt Williams, which is a firm in Richmond, very good firm, and he went up there and told his brother that, and his brother had him do an affidavit in detail. So if he got run over by a truck, they'd have some testimony. And he also, that would confirm that he didn't make it up a week later. And so apparently he had an affidavit that he could have used to bolster his credibility. And then he didn't say anything. He told his wife he didn't say anything to anybody else till I happened to run into her in the bar library. I do, but I don't remember. I remember we talked to some people, but that one was me solely, so I remember that in more detail. There were other people. Again, we had a lady who sold Tupperware or something, and she would go around and talk to people and ask them if they knew anything. But there were a bunch of people, almost everybody, but not everybody in the neighborhood was interviewed. Some people thought they heard something or weren't sure if they did or saw cars or things like that. She thought she heard something, as I recall. I'm not very clear on that. Right. But she rolled over and went back to bed. I mean, there wasn't anybody that got up to investigate the noise, and there apparently was some noise. But the main highway was 100 yards from that. And if you parked on the main highway, you would come right by this guy Milne's house to get to McDonald's. Yeah, well, not that much. At that time, there wasn't that much traffic, and this was late at night, so there wouldn't have been much. There could have been some noise, but not that much. I'm trying to think. There were people that heard different things or saw different things, but nothing that I can right this second put my finger on. That I don't remember putting any of those people on the witness stand. Very much. I didn't. The first couple of years, I was on the briefs, and I remember they would send me the briefs, and I would read them, and I might call Bernie and say, or one of the other attorneys, and say, paragraph so and so. I don't think I would put it that way, but I didn't interject myself at all, really. And then I kind of faded away. I don't do any criminal work, and my usefulness, because they uncovered a lot more evidence than I knew about at the time, so I wasn't the best person to comment on a lot of the issues that they were having. I think I told you I got a call from Bill Thompson, the prosecutor, saying, "Jim, there's not enough evidence to convict him." I said, "I agree. You've got to realize I looked at this from the evidentiary standpoint up until today and from the personality standpoint. And I never saw either one that would tell me that Jeffrey McDonald is guilty." And Bill Thompson, and again, he and I became friends, and he went to my son's wedding and down in Florida, and he used to come here and stay every now and then. And he's like me. He said there wasn't enough evidence, so the evidence wasn't there. And he was talking totally as a lawyer from the evidence standpoint. Yeah, and he's like me. He didn't go after that. But the evidence since then, I don't think it's been damning. I think it's been exonerating, if anything else. I did, but it's been a long time. And I would just skim through it, just out of, it's a story that'll never die. I mean, you contacted me in June or something saying you were coming up here. I said, "Oh, my God. Here it comes again." And I've stayed away. I've stayed away from these things. But I checked you out on the internet, and I talked to Mike Malley, so I went ahead and said maybe this is the last time, because I'm not going to last but so much longer myself. It will never die. I don't know what it is about this case. It rears its ugly head every couple of years, Yeah, that's part of it, but part of it is just it's kind of like a soap opera. Because you do have the Princeton graduate, doctor, all-American boy, pregnant wife, children. Nobody says that I'm aware of anything bad about him. Green Beret, which was a big deal back then, and then it kind of faded out of consciousness. And it just struck all the chords that people were interested in. Now, the younger generation doesn't have any idea what you're talking about. Well, I guess they will, and also at the time, there was the anti-Army feeling at the time. And we helped the anti-Army feeling because we felt the investigation was not properly done, and we made no bones about it. Yeah, I shouldn't say this, but I've sometimes thought to myself, I hope he did it because he's been punished for it. I don't believe he did it, but I mean, he's been punished for it. And if he got out of prison right now, I don't know what would happen to him. And I think that it's still before the Fourth Circuit, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know what will happen then. Yeah. Well, I don't know that. I was contacted, I guess Bernie, I don't have any idea, in 1984, and asked if I knew anything about a piece of skin under Jeffrey's fingernail. I don't know which one. And I said no. See, it's not improper to ask me because Mike Malley and I were on the scene. Now, if Mike knew something about it, fine. They should have asked him too, and I bet they did. But they asked me to, and most everything the Army presented, they presented to me because I was the assigned counsel. But apparently there was a piece of flesh or something underneath Jeffrey's fingernail. Yeah, I did an affidavit on it, but okay. But anyway, I did an affidavit. It was the daughter's. It's been a long time. Okay. Well, that's what I started to say, and I thought you corrected me and said it was the daughter's, and I remembered there was some skin under the daughter's too. But they asked me if I knew that this piece of skin had been lost, and I said no, because candidly we would have complained mightily about it, because that's what we were doing at the time. And also I would have had it in my files were a little more organized back then than they are now, especially going into the trial I had, which may look unorganized to you, but they work for me. But we would have had that down, and we would have had somebody to testify about that, and we didn't, because that would have been on top of the footprints they didn't discover and all the other evidence. We would have thrown that in there to show how bad the investigation was. Summers said he told me we got in an argument about it, but we got in a couple of arguments, and they were not, nothing wrong with that. But I don't recall anything about that. I don't know if they did or not. I mean, I don't have, what? Okay. I get these robocalls. I don't know what in the world that is. That could be right, yeah. They could be sitting on there, but I don't know what it is, Really? Okay. We did? I have no idea. As I recall, I only met him at the interview by the FBI. I don't know whether he lives here in Roanoke or not. I have no idea. That's been a long time ago. I read the affidavit, and I'll just have to stand by the affidavit because at that time, in the affidavit, I said I looked in my files. There was nothing in my files that showed, and the files in 1984 were in better shape than they are today. That's for sure. And I just didn't know anything about it. And if I had known something about it, it would have been in my files. We would have complained about it at the Article 32 hearing. It would have been something we'd have put on the record, I'm sure. No, I'm not going to say that. I think they probably lost it. I'm just being honest with you. I don't think they intentionally, because at that time there was no DNA evidence or anything like that. I don't think they could have proved that it meant anything. Maybe I don't understand what's going on, but today it would have made a difference because it would have been a piece of skin you could get DNA off of. But back then, I don't think there's any malicious intent behind that at all. I think it's just a piece of evidence that got lost. I wouldn't think so. I think most everybody involved is dead. So I don't think there'll be any great reaction. And I don't know. I hadn't seen any of the Army investigators or anything. The only person that was involved in it that I've talked to over the years has been Bill Thompson. He was one of the prosecutors. And it certainly didn't bother him. He and I, a couple of months after this case was over, we're getting in trouble, the two of us again, trying cases at Fort Bragg. I can remember the colonel being mad at the two of us so mad he couldn't stand it. I mean, life goes on. And I hadn't talked to Cliff Summers. My guess would be he wouldn't be mad. I have no idea. I remember meeting him, and at one time Freddie Kassab was in our office almost on a daily basis, reading this, that, and the other. And I got the impression he was having a small drink at the same time. And I just kind of stayed away from him because I didn't need to get involved in that. But he wasn't helpful. He was helpful in that he backed Jeff completely, but he wasn't helpful in being around the office. Very strong. As I recall, the phrase that I recalled is him basically testifying, I think it was in the 32, if not he said it, that if I had another daughter, I'd want the same son-in-law. And I do remember that phrase because it was catchy, for want of a better term. But I didn't put him on the stand, and I really didn't have much to do with it. Well, the Army ordered Cliff, I think, and me not to talk to the press. And I don't blame them. And I didn't talk to the press. I mean, if I were talking to a press guy, and they were all around my back door all the time, we were talking about a football game or something like that. The prosecution was the same way, but Bernie had free reign. And I remember we took a break in the middle of the summer sometime, and the Raleigh News and Observer all of a sudden came out with a story that was 180 degrees against us. They'd been backing us all along. They wrote this horrible story about us. We said, "Why'd you do that?" And he said, "Well, the Army said, you got to be fair. So we decided we'd write one against you." You know, it was amazing. Well, Bernie was an affable person. People liked Bernie. I don't think it came across in the trial in Raleigh, but it was funny. By the time the Article 32 was over, Colonel Rock, I could tell, liked Bernie. I mean, they would, the hearing's over and you get up and you say 3 words to the other side or something like that. And Bernie and Colonel Rock could not have been more different. I mean, absolutely they couldn't have been more different. But I could tell that Colonel Rock figured out Bernie was a pretty good guy. He was a good lawyer. And I'm sure that Bill told Colonel Rock what Bernie was doing when he did this or did that. But Bernie was easy to talk to. He was a nice fellow. He was. He may or may not have, but Colonel Rock was very intelligent. And Colonel Rock didn't jump to decisions. He was head of psychological operations. So I don't know what that meant in the way of training. But when you're head of the 2nd PSYOPs group and the special headquarters of the Special Forces, you got to have a little brain power. That's why he was there. And it is kind of funny. A lot of those officers, there were people at Fort Bragg of every ilk you've ever seen. And a whole lot of those officers really understood. General Tolson, who we referred to, he, for example, was famous, at least among us few JAG officers, for sending people who'd been convicted of AWOL back to duty. And my colonel, as Colonel Whitcover was my colonel, he'd go over there and he'd have a stack of papers about that tall, and the bottom 3 would be 3 guys that had been convicted of AWOL, and the commanding officers that said, they went AWOL, but he's really a pretty good guy. So he'd get General Tolson in a good mood. He said, "General Tolson, we think you ought to commute to sentences." And General Tolson's been known to call some guy out of the stockade. The guy's a prisoner, and he brings him up to the 3-star general's office, and the general sits him down and gives him a cup of coffee and said, "I'm going to send you back to duty, but if you don't do your job, I'm going to come after you myself." But what he was trying to do was help people out. And just to give you an idea that not all those people at Fort Bragg were not unaware of the world that was going on, and they were trying to do their best, and Colonel Rock was one of them. Yeah, I was about to be drafted when I signed up. I may have even gotten a draft notice, but I signed up because I knew I was going to get one, because I was a lawyer. I went to Hampton Sydney College, which is a small men's school down in Southside Virginia. It's a good school, and I was a senior, and I thought to myself, what am I going to do? And my stepfather, he'd been in the First World War and the Second World War, so had everybody else in my family. He said, "Well, I think you might enjoy the Marines." I thought, that's not a very good idea. And so I thought about law school because I'd had some ancestors that had been lawyers. And I took the LSAT tests, and I did pretty well on them. I did very well on them. And so I got in all the law schools in Virginia and decided to go, and never regretted it. Yeah. Well, I got out of, I went to Washington Lee Law School, and I graduated in June of '67. And at that time, I was going to be drafted. I was married, but I had no children. And I was going to be drafted. So I applied to get a JAG commission, and I applied for Officer Candidate School. I was immediately accepted in Officer Candidate School, and I went like September the 1st or thereabouts, off to training and this, that, and the other. And then about halfway through, I got an offer to become a JAG officer. And I did want to practice law. They said, "We'll make you a captain right this minute." I said, "Okay, and we'll send you to Fort Bragg." I said, "Okay." And it worked out well. I had, even though I didn't want to go in the Army, I had a great experience, and I met a whole lot of people that I really enjoyed being with. It's fun, yeah. I can remember trying 7 cases one day, and I think I held the record. I'm not saying I did a very good job, but I tried 7 cases. I think I was prosecuted 7 cases in one day. But you did get a lot of experience. And when I first went to Fort Bragg, we had a really good military judge who you get up there and say something really dumb, and he'd say, "You didn't really say that, you said something else." And that's right, I did. And we had a really good SJA, Colonel Whitcover, and he tried to train his lawyers, and it was really appreciated later. What good men I had to serve under. I don't have any idea about that, because I went to Fort Bragg in December of '67, and Bill Thompson and Charlie Sheehan, 2 other lawyers, came about the same time. They'd been to JAG school, I hadn't. I went to JAG school, which was in Charlottesville, Virginia, for 3 months in March, April, May of '68, then came back. But I felt like I had basically the same. There were some older lawyers there, and they left, and Bill and Charlie and I, and then there was another lawyer from Oklahoma who came in, and 2 or 3 others, and then I don't know when Cliff came. He came later. I didn't run around with Cliff as much as I did Bill Thompson and Charlie Sheehan. But after about 2 years, they sent me to JFK Center, and they sent Bill over the 82nd because we were getting ready to go to Vietnam. And I don't know what and he put in a new commanding officer, Colonel Lennon, who I never really served under and never really liked a whole lot. He and Bill and I had a little trouble with him on occasion. I don't know why Cliff would have been ahead of anybody else. I don't remember when Ham Bill came. I knew him, but I didn't run around with him that much. Well, you mean before the case or after?
Before the case.
Well, before the case, I was prosecuting and defending court-martials. You would inevitably, if it were something other than an AWOL or something like that, you meet with whoever investigated it to get ready to put on the case, put on the evidence. So you got to know CID officers and MPs and what like that. Even prosecution or defendants, you had a pleasant relationship with them, and because there was never any real problem with CID or that I ever had, you know. And she'd work back and forth. And as I say, when I went to JFK, we didn't do much court-martial work, and but I still knew a lot of CID guys. Most of the investigators are lower guys. After the trial, they didn't love me as much as they had before the trial, and Colonel Lennon didn't like me at all. My name is James F. Douthat. I was the assigned military defense counsel for Captain Jeffrey R. Mennel in 1970 in the investigation and prosecution in the Article 32 hearing before Colonel Rock at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, into the death of Captain McDonald's or Dr. McDonald's wife and 2 children. My name is James F. Douthat. In 1970, I was assigned to Special Warfare Center in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as a JAG officer, and I was the assigned counsel to defend Captain Jeffrey McDonald in the prosecution of Captain McDonald for the supposed murder of his wife and 2 children. Well, the Article 32 was scheduled on what they call Smoke Bomb Hill. That's the old section of the JFK Center, and all the buildings there were the Second World War wooden buildings like you saw in all the movies in the 50s. If you came in the front door, you came into a large room, which is the hearing room. And when I say large, it was 25 feet wide and 30 feet long. I'm probably wrong with that, but it's a good size room. Plenty of room for 2 desks for opposing counsel, a witness stand, and for Colonel Rock and his assistant. And behind that, there was a small office that was my office. And it was I say small, it was fine for what we needed it, and it had plenty of room for storage of files and to work and this, that, and the other. And out the back, there were long steps that went down because it was on a hillside. And it was this white U.S. Army issue 1945 building. It was clean, it was nice, it was functional, it worked fine. I think it was open to the public for, as I recall, we asked for it to be open. And we started in the morning, and it was open all morning long, and we had like 1 or 2 witnesses. And then in the afternoon, they closed it to the public. And we argued about that back and forth. I think we after they closed it to the public, we took a recess and we argued back and forth as to try to get open. It ultimately was not opened again. Around the outside all the time, quite often behind our steps that went down from my office, there were 3 or 4 or 5 reporters or camera people from various ABC, NBC, whoever it might be. There was always a lot of activity around that. It was, but he didn't directly talk to the media, so to speak. I think later on, when some of the media had been around for a while and you got to know him, he might pass a pleasantry with one of them, just like I would. I didn't talk to the media about any factual matter at all. And Bernie Siegel and Dennis Eisman did, and that was fine. That was their job. But the media was easy to deal with because they were polite. They were asking questions. If you said no, they took it as no. If you said yes, they asked something else. And they were just trying to cover what was going on. And we usually had more people on the back of our office Then the prosecution did. The prosecution came in from the other side. I'm not even sure. I never went in their office, so I don't know what it looks like. I don't think they talked to the media at all. There was nobody that the prosecution had that would talk to the media, and we had Bernie Siegel and Dennis Heisman to do it. He was pretty even-keeled, as best I could say. I mean, there were things that bothered him, but we had beaten on him to the extent as don't react to anything. And he finally he's realizing the seriousness of the situation. He was realizing that he had to be controlled, and he was controlled. And I could tell, because I knew him, that it was tough on him. He wasn't thrown into the media or thrown into some situation he'd have had to respond to. I'm sure in his heart of hearts he worried about it, because everybody worried about it. But I had the feeling he thought he was innocent and he was going to was not going to be convicted, to be vindicated. And he was frustrated at some of the things that were said, some of the evidence that came in, and all that. But that frustration was not shown in the courtroom necessarily, or in the outside where anybody could see it. It was more in the office. We were talking about something. And the good thing was there were 4 attorneys, and Mike, of course, was a good friend of his and knew him better than anybody, and you could talk to him. And he was smart, and he understood when you told him what was going on, he would understand it and why we were doing this, that, and the other. I'm not sure I know that much about it, to be frank. The only thing I know is kind of what I've read in the newspaper. And I don't think they found a whole lot, but I think they found something. But I just really never got involved in that. Yep. Well, I always marveled about the hair, because the prosecution or the government wanted hair samples. And we discussed it, and if they had, in our opinion, properly filed the motion to do it, it had been granted, and he'd have been ordered to provide a hair sample. We went to the federal court. I didn't do it. I was there when they filed it, but I didn't sign the pleadings in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, objecting to it. And that was Judge Butler. And he said, basically, it's not my argument to go back to the military court, which was absolutely correct. For whatever reason, the government did not pursue all their legal remedies. They pursued them somewhat, and then they pursued actively and physically, which at the time I thought was kind of stupid. It illustrates their frustration. I mean, I think they could have gotten it by an order of the court, an order of the immediate appeal to the United States Court of Appeals, Military Court of Appeals. I think that's the right name, or whatever court they had to go to do it, but it never happened. Colonel Rock may have ordered it too. Well, they got it. I was not there when that took place. Mike Malley and I, we were going to meet him, and we had somewhere we had to go to do something, go to the PX, go to do something. And we went off in one direction, they went off in another, and that's when the altercation took place. I heard that the MPs stopped the car, and that Bernie Siegel, Dennis Heisman, MacDonald, and maybe somebody else, and of who I can't remember, were in the car, ordered them out. And then, as I recall, Heisman got out and said something to the MPs that were doing it, and I'm told that they threw him on the ground. And I don't doubt that. I'm sure he would have irritated him enough to throw him on the ground. But he was smart enough that he wasn't going to start a physical altercation. He also wasn't very big. And he was thrown to the ground, and his glasses were broken, and Bernie was pushed up against a car. And after that, I was not there, but I think they ended up at Cape Fear Hospital, and I had some photographs of it, coming out with their hair disheveled, and I almost kept a straight face every time I looked at him. I think Jeffrey was smart enough and had been told, you just stand there and do nothing. Jeffrey had been counseled on that stuff. You know, it's interesting you bring that up. It made me think. I hadn't thought about this in years. When we went to Walter Reed Army Hospital, and we stayed for Jeffrey to get his psychological evaluation, we stayed in the Walter Reed Inn. They had a little bar down there. It was very nice. And sometimes we went out and had dinner, a restaurant that was in the neighborhood, and we just get a pizza or spaghetti or something. But in the evening, sometimes we'd have drink in that bar. Jeffrey really didn't drink, but the escort officer and I would have a drink. We were in there one night, and somebody in the escort officer started to almost get into it. And I turned to Jeffrey and I said, you go to the room. I'm going to stay with the escort officer and make sure that nothing happens. Jeffrey went to the room. I went to the men's room, and somebody in there, had to be a CID officer, said, that was the right thing to do. I'm glad to see you went. So we had other people in the room we didn't even know about. I thought it was pretty interesting. I was followed on a number of occasions. Well, one of them, I'm pretty sure it was the day they did the hair sample. Mike Malley was driving, and we were going to go to somewhere and do something for 10 minutes and meet them. And as we were driving away, we looked in the rearview mirror, and Mike said to me, I think that car's following us. And we looked back, and we would turn left and turn right, and the car's, I think it is too. We ended up over by Womack Army Hospital. We really had a bad attitude. You've got to realize that. We went around the Womack Army Hospital, and as we cut through the parking lot, in order for this car to keep us within its sight, it had to go down a one-way entrance ramp the wrong way. We cut right across and stopped them. I got out in uniform, and they were breaking the law. I ordered them to stop, and there's nothing they could do. We had them blocked. So I've got a photograph of this somewhere. We took their photograph, and I ordered them to give me their identification, which they did. And I said, why were y'all following us? And they said, we weren't following you. And then over their car radio came, where's Captain Douthat now? Well, I couldn't help it. I broke into hysterics laughing and let the poor CID officers go. I have no idea. Well, they did want to know who we were talking to, and they did want to, because some of the people we talked to were talked to by them immediately thereafter. And some of the people we talked to on the telephone were contacted the next day. That didn't apply directly to me, but I know it did to Jeffrey. The people that would call him or he would talk to, he'd never talked to before. And the CID would be at their doorstep the next day. And they couldn't accomplish much. I'd have been happy to tell them who we were talking to, because we were asking them who they were talking to, and we found out to a certain degree. We were talking to more people than they were, and we were getting better results, I believe. I'm not sure. I read something about that. I think it was, don't hold me to it, but I think it was the fact that it was a grass lawn like in front of my house today that was wet like today, and there was not enough grass tromped in the house. But that's not correct either, because the MPs tracked grass in there all day long, so I have no idea. We thought it was important because we wanted to find out what happened. We wanted to find out what it looked like right after it happened. We would talk to one witness, and they would tell us everything. And I'll use as an example the white flower pot that was sitting up. That was a big deal to the prosecution, and we wanted to know how it got from laying on its side to sitting up as it was in the photograph. Well, to do that, we would ask somebody. And it took a while for somebody to say, oh, yeah, I picked it up. But then it dawned on us we wanted to find out who was in the house. So we would ask you who was in the house that you saw, and you would give me 3 names, and I'd ask the next person the same thing. We were trying to get a list, and I think we got up to a dozen or 15 people that were in the house, including a next-door neighbor, one of whom came in to identify the bodies, but another one who just came in, he said, I don't know how many MPs tromped through to see everything. And there was one person, as I recall, they never identified. I mean, nobody ever figured out who he was, because we asked everybody who was the guy. He was dressed somewhere like a red shirt and something like that. Nobody ever knew. And we thought that was pretty important. Not that that person did anything, but they could have. But somebody stole Jeffrey MacDonald's wallet. And that was kind of interesting in the middle of a homicide investigation, right in the middle of the crime scene. Again, it helped us reconstruct what the scene looked like. It was important from our standpoint and from the government standpoint. The orientation of the bodies and whether they were covered or not covered. And some people said one thing and some people said the other. But the first ones in the door were the ones we wanted, and we finally got to them. They were some of the first in the back door. The other people were trying to get in the front, and I think they went around to the back. And again, I think I've already said, I thought I'd forgotten Severe's name, but I remember him more by name than anything else. I remember Micah more specifically. But they came around and went in and attended to their business very well, and then a trail of people kind of stomped through. The government had gone on the premise that MacDonald had staged the scene. And some of the issues that they used to illustrate this, or that, quote, proved what they said, were the white flower pot, table that would never end up on its side, the orientation of the bodies, and certain fingerprints and footprints and this, that, and the other. But a lot of those things were disproven because you'd have a CID officer who testified what he saw at 4 in the morning, but you'd have 2 MPs that were there at 3 o'clock and they saw something different. They're the ones you had to believe because they were the first on the scene. And there were large things that you wouldn't forget that would be imprinted on your memory. So we wanted to disprove what the evidence, quote unquote, of the prosecution attempted to show. You couldn't trust it. You not only couldn't trust the evidence, you not only couldn't trust the evidence, but there was testimony the evidence was ABC, but if we went to the original source, the evidence was XYZ. So we wanted to disprove the evidence. Then we wanted to also prove that you couldn't rely on a lot of the evidence because it had been changed. And to me, the first thing you do is secure a crime scene, and that was not done. It was really just a herd of people just tromping in and out. I mean, ambulance drivers, MPs, CIDs, neighbors, people they don't know who they are. And I want to say we had 15 people we knew were in that house. I think they wanted to say he was on drugs, but the evidence was, to me, the evidence was contrary. One, he was pretty anti-drug, to be honest with you. I mean, he truly was. And everything I heard about him before it happened and everything I knew about him after I met him. And secondly, if I'm not mistaken, they took blood samples from him and tested him and tested Colette too, if I'm not mistaken. There was just no trace. I think it may have been a trace that she had had a half a beer or something like that. I don't quote me on it, but it was nothing. I mean, there wasn't anything to it. And they had the physical evidence, which, well, Bill wanted to be either the prosecutor or the defense counsel, just as I did. And what had happened is I had a little lead time. So I had sent a written request for him to be assigned to the 82nd Airborne where he was. And the 82nd Airborne had nothing to do with this investigation. So they basically were going to approve it, or maybe they had approved it. And I also, candidly, if Bill wasn't going to be on my side, I didn't really want him on the other side. He was my good friend, but still, this was love and war, you know. But I wasn't surprised when they didn't assign him to me. And I wasn't surprised when they assigned him to the prosecution, because he was a very good trial lawyer, and he'd had more experience than any other trial lawyer on the post. We talked in short spurts and poked each other in the ribs and laughed. I mean, it didn't take long for the two of us to be, when this thing was all over. I know that Jeff and Mike Malley will just cringe to hear me say this, but it didn't take me long to be good friends with Bill Thompson again. We were out running around. Our wives never stopped. They were great friends. We never sat down and compared notes for more than 3 minutes, you know. I mean, we just didn't. But I think I did tell you, when Jeffrey got convicted in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, I got a call from Bill. He couldn't believe it. He said, "There's not enough evidence. What in the world happened?" I said, "I don't know, Bill. I wasn't there." I can't tell you whether he thought one way or the other. He never. I know for a fact he thought there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, because he had said that, and he said that to me more than once. But whether he, in his own mind, thought just because he'd been on that side that he was guilty, I kind of doubt, because he would have poked me in the ribs about saying that, I believe. But my memory is not good enough to give you any definite. That's just not something I did. I mean, I'm sure I was involved in it, but I just today can't recall. I remember we had all these photographs and we compared them back and forth and went over them with a fine-tooth comb. I'll guarantee you that. Mike Malley and I did that. We did that for hours on end. Well, it was a high-five moment when we figured out that where the chair had been and the table had hit it. I do remember that. It was aha. And it worked out. We didn't know if it was going to work, but it did work out. I don't know, because they would have done that. Stokely wasn't presented to the CID until the 32 was just about over. And I don't know what the CID did after that. But again, I'm sure. But it was on their radar, but they cut the set off. I mean, she was there, she was interested, it was somebody they should have looked at, and they didn't do it. And I don't think she was on the radar so much that they would have been forced to compare it. And I'm sure I've thought about that myself, because she'd been in jail 2 or 3 times, and they bound to have had her fingerprints. Whether they did or not, I have no idea, because there were a number of fingerprints that were identifiable but were never identified. I seem to think there were, but I can't be quoted on that, because it's been so long ago that I hadn't reviewed my files. I had a kind of chart of fingerprints at one time that I drew up myself, and I don't know what happened to it. But Jim Nance and I went to VES together, and we were friends in high school. When I came to Fort Bragg, he was practicing law in Fayetteville with his father's firm, a very good firm in Fayetteville. I don't think they did criminal work, but they were a very good law firm. And I saw him a few times. I think we went to dinner once or twice, and we didn't run around with so much. But he's really a good lawyer and a nice guy. When this case came up, we hired Jim to be local counsel, to go into district court and to do this, that, and the other. He very well respected, would do a good job. He did all the way through and was very helpful. After the 32 was over, I'm going to tell you December or January, don't quote me, I just forget. One day, the CID came into my office, and they had a big old bag, as I recall, and they had boots. Had these, I don't know if they brought it in, I remember photographs. But they said I needed to sign to receive some boots and a hat and whatnot that had been given to the CID by Jim Nance. And I think Jim had called me, but I hadn't talked to him at the time. And I said, well, what is this? He said, well, you're still Captain McDonald's lawyer. I said, well, I'll sign a receipt for it, but you're going to keep it. I'm not going to do it. You're investigating it. And what they had is a hat and boots and something else that had been taken to Jim Nance. His firm was well known in Fayetteville, and it was downtown. And somebody who I think had some connection with Lena Stokely brought those boots and stuff to him and said, they're her boots and hats, and maybe a wig. Maybe I can't testify to that. It always seemed to go along. They were those items were taken by the CID. Now, I never gave it another thought. I mean, it didn't take much longer for me to sign off on it than for me to tell you right now. When they went back to try Jeffrey in the district court, it never even entered my mind, when I was talking to Bernie and them, it never entered my mind to tell them about it, because I would have assumed they would have filed whatever documents or papers were necessary to get the evidence the CID had. Apparently, they were never told about this. There was a whole lot of stuff apparently they were never told about. And I don't know when they found out about it, but sometime later, they called me and asked me if I knew anything about it, and that's all I knew. I'm not even sure that I ever touched him. I mean, it was just a 3-minute, 5-minute deal, you know. Oh, yeah. Why? I don't have any idea. I can only assume, and I have no facts, but it was poor investigation on this side and having blinders on this side, because I don't understand why, especially when we started pointing things out, they didn't go backtrack and find out what's going on. I mean, we would put on evidence, or we would see something, and they know that we found something out, and then they wouldn't go behind us and find out what it was. I was absolutely amazed. I was happy to go behind the CID on their investigation, because I found out one of the things I would find out is what questions they asked the witness. If I found out the questions they asked the witness, I knew what they were thinking and how they were proceeding. And they didn't do that to us. And they didn't, if we had a witness, and I think they knew about some of our witnesses because they followed us, sometimes they'd interview that witness and get no information at all. Because sometimes a witness would call us, and we'd ask them what they asked, and they were very perfunctory and almost threatening, some of them said. Not to me, but I think Mike Malley had some of it. They did to it. Well, that's true, too. Fayetteville there were some people who were very pro-military and some that were unbelievably anti-military. And we were kind of in the middle. We were mostly dealing with normal human beings, except for Helena Stokely and her crowd. I didn't worry too much about explaining it. It was what it was. But I thought about it, and in talking to physicians and whatnot, I found the wound that collapsed his lung was potentially a very, very serious and could have been a fatal wound. The other, explaining to the hearing officer, I didn't make the argument, but Bernie Siegel made the argument. And I'm sure he just dwelt on the fact that there were wounds, and if he had been killed, we wouldn't have been there. So it's kind of hard. It's kind of like the evidence is he was in the room, therefore he did it. You know, give me some evidence of what he was doing in the room, and who else was in the room, and who wasn't in the room, and what happened. I didn't worry about it. Did I see what? I saw that. No, I don't. Not to hurt your feelings. I thought he was acting like a Yankee. He was just. For whatever reason, it may have been, I had this thought, it may have been his only time to have told everybody off, for want of a better term, for what he'd been through, and to blow off a little steam or something. But he'd been held down, and it was not difficult to do. But I mean, he'd been said, you can't say this, you can't say that, you've got to just be there in presence and not in vocal and not do anything for so long. And he'd been under such pressure that I just assumed he had let loose some pressure. I didn't really think, uh-oh. I just thought that was stupid. I didn't think, uh-oh, because it never dawned on me that the father-in-law was going to press like he did, and I didn't realize that the federal authorities were still after him as much as they were. I didn't realize how mad they were. Well, I agree, yeah. I'm not arguing with it. But he had been under unbelievable pressure. He hadn't kept the muzzle on him, I don't mean to imply we felt we needed to, but we had to tell him you couldn't do anything. If somebody came up and stomped on your foot, you had to just take a step back. I mean, you couldn't do anything because he was under the spotlight for a year. I forget when he went on to Dick Cavett, but it was about a year from whenever I saw the movie. Well, I think two things. One, I think he was waffling and lost. I think he was kind of lost. He was fairly naive, and I don't think he expected to be charged. I think he was like you hit him in the head with a 2x4, and I really do think that was it. And also, I mean that was a whole lot of it. And then a lot of it also is he is resilient and he is a fighter. He never gave up throughout this entire thing, and he was probably going to argue back with the CID. Although I think he was totally taken aback by their accusations. From what I understood, and I thought about it a lot and we talked, I don't think he had any idea. If you'd been listening to television and reading the paper, there's just no way that you would have thought that would have ever happened. I think they trapped him pretty well. Yeah, but I can't tell you when I did. I'm like you, I remember it more in the Fatal Vision TV show. And I just kind of shook my head then because I didn't think it was a fair representation. I don't think I got through it either. I read the book, and that was interesting. The TV show was not well done. And there was so much in it that didn't strike home with me that I thought was made for TV. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that, and somebody kept me informed that the author paid him like $400,000. And that was kind of amazing to pay somebody who was a convicted murderer for slander. It's interesting. I bought the book Fatal Vision, and I did not talk to the author. I think I got a telephone call from somebody saying they were him anyhow. And it was a short conversation because I won't say he insulted me, whoever it was, but we did not get along from the very first word. And I finally said goodbye, and it didn't take me long. And it could have been somebody else because I've had people call me up and want to talk about it, and I have no idea who they are. You were one of them. It was interesting to read the book. You read about 4 or 5 chapters, and all of a sudden it just switches. And it's going like this, and then it goes like this. I was kind of amazed at that. I thought he was working for Jeffrey. I had no idea. I wasn't involved in that in the least. Sometimes to get the evidence, you had to fight a little bit back and forth, but not really. I was used to fighting back and forth. I was bothered by Micah's first testimony, and I believe he gave a sworn statement that said he had seen somebody that met the description. Not it was the person, but it met the description up at Maloney Village, which was the shopping center. And I was taken aback that I got the second version and not the first. And I'm not sure that we got cooperation as such, but we ended up getting, I think, everything. I don't think we got the first. I think the first statement he gave was destroyed. I heard about it, but I never saw it. I got the second one, which basically was the same thing, except it deleted any reference to somebody at Maloney Village. Say that again. Well, he was, as I've said, I think he was a very good policeman and did a good job. Did, in my opinion, maybe the best job at the crime scene that night. And the prosecution wanted to put him on because he was credible. And they put him on, and he testified what he saw and what he did and this, that, and the other, and he was a good witness. Sometime thereafter, we found out that he had seen on the way to Jeffrey MacDonald's house at the corner where Maloney Village is, which is about 2 blocks from Jeffrey's house, a filling station and a small shopping center named Maloney Village. He'd seen a girl that met the description of Jeffrey MacDonald that gave him. He'd seen this girl hiding in the bushes or by the bushes, but he hadn't testified to it. And that was for somebody on the way with a blue light and an emergency thing to see somebody just like Jeffrey told him as he's laying on the floor. So he came to us, or he got word to us, and he knew that. We talked to him. We called him back as our first or second witness. And it was a pretty good move. Colonel Rock, who's a very honorable man, did not like the fact that fact was left out the first time around. I could see it in his eyes. That was the purpose. There's no question. But it did set the tone. And they should have, if you're a trial lawyer and you got some really bad evidence, you're much better off to get it out on your side of the table and then make light of it or somehow counter it. And they didn't do that. They did just the opposite. They thought they were going to hide it. And I thought that hiding that was not proper. Came up with a what?
A motive.
No, I haven't heard a motive yet. I mean, I hadn't heard a motive yet. They came up with a child wet into bed, and that's pretty normal. I've had a couple children, and that's not consistent with anything else I know about Jeffrey MacDonald or anything I ever heard anybody say, and isn't much of a motive for murder. Yeah, oh yeah. But if you know a motive, I'd be curious to hear it, because I've never heard it. Well, give me a call. Well, you wouldn't think this would be the case. Bernie, who was my friend, and an attorney I thought was a really good attorney, great cross-examiner. But this was back in the 70s. Bernie had lapels out to here and a tie out to here, long hair. He looked just like Counsel. He had a South Philly accent, and you would have thought that Colonel Rock would not have liked him. But on the other hand, Colonel Rock, and I knew this, was a really intelligent man, and he didn't look at what the width of the lapels was. He looked at the person, and so Colonel Rock easily got through to Bernie, and Bernie got through to Colonel Rock, and I think they got along well. And if I'm not mistaken, when the thing was over, I shouldn't say this, but I think Ham Beal or somebody said, well, maybe we ought to get together and have dinner some night, not talking about the thing, because we were not fighting with Colonel Rock. In other words, Colonel Rock didn't hold him to any account because he didn't look like a West Pointer. I'm not sure the same thing held true in Raleigh, North Carolina in the Eastern District. I'm not sure that the jury and the judge and the prosecutor saw through Bernie. They should have had probably Wade Smith lead the charge more than he did. Bernie was probably as good a lawyer as he was and as good a person as he was. He's probably not the guy to try a case in the Middle District of North Carolina at that time. Oh, we didn't have a dinner. We talked about it. We would have enjoyed to have, I didn't realize, if I heard that, I'd forgotten. Oh, we did, well, good for him. But from everything I know about Wade Smith, he's a really top lawyer down there in every way. I've never heard anything bad about him. And he probably should have been more of a lead counsel in that case. That's what I've been told, and I don't know. No, we never did, other than we we looked into Colette's mental health only in talking to her friends, and we ended up talking to a bunch of her friends. It wasn't a direct inquiry, but it was a thorough inquiry. You knew Colette, was she happy? Oh, yes, she was, and we uniformly got the response that she was pregnant, she was happy, she was glad to be at Fort Bragg because it was a nice place to be, and there were a lot of young people, and she was getting along well, and we found the girl that she had given a ride to school with and talked to her, and she said the same thing. She was in a good mood that night, happy, and people in the classroom, she was in a good mood and happy, and nobody saw anything bad. And it's interesting. I don't think the CID ever asked. I don't think they ever tracked down who lived next to the girl that she rode with. And it wasn't that hard to do. But that's the kind of thing we were forced to do ourselves, which meant we remembered it. But I don't think the CID bothered to find who Colette rode to school with that night and who came back with her and what her mental state was. To my knowledge, they never did. I never heard anything like that. I didn't look for it, but I would have thought I would have found out something because of the people we talked to. Most of the people we talked to were their friends or their girlfriends or their somebody that Jeff knew would come by to visit him, and we'd be there, and we'd wander out, and they would say spontaneously, oh, they were, how well they were together and this, that, and the other. We didn't ask them because it was pretty apparent we got spontaneous comments from friends. And we contacted some other people that were not at Fort Bragg, too. I think Mike Malley did that more than I did. Oh, no doubt. Well, he theoretically had it made, and Army doctors at that time would go in. If they went to Vietnam, it was usually not that bad because they were behind the lines, for want of a better term, or not out on the front. And they got paid well, and they were well respected. We were told that the day before or 2 days before the murder, he'd been, I forget what hospital, and somebody come in with a bad overdose. And we were told that a day or two before the murders, Jeff had been working in a hospital, and somebody had come in with a bad drug overdose. And the end result was the police were called, and I think the 2 soldiers that brought him in were arrested, if I'm not mistaken. But anyhow, there was some altercation back and forth, and Jeff had gotten the reputation, or they had said that he was bad for drug people, and there were people after him. We tried to trace them down, and I can't remember that we were particularly successful. We kind of honed in on Stokely later. But there was an altercation, and we were of the opinion at one time that this may have been payback because these people had been picked up and gone to jail, and they were going to be in trouble, both with civilian and military authorities, so maybe they had come over there to pay Jeff back. I don't know. No. Harrison?
Yeah.
If I shouldn't laugh. But Jeff was a doctor. I was a lawyer. I don't consider I was much of a soldier, just between you and me. Harrison was a soldier. He'd been here, there, and elsewhere, and there were plenty of people at Fort Bragg who were rough, tough, mean soldiers. Some of them you didn't want to get close to. Some of them were the nicest people you ever met in your life. Harrison apparently had this reputation of being tough and mean and this, that, and the other, and I think the CID was scared of him. I'll be perfectly frank with you. I think I don't know what he had done for a living or hadn't done for a living, but I think they were scared of him. And I was with him a lot because he was escort officer back and forth. And the funniest thing was, and I shouldn't tell you this, but I will, we were sitting down there at the office, and I just met him, and we couldn't get the lock open on the door. And he said, well, if I had my lock-picking tools, I could get it. Sometimes you can get it with a paper clip. And she just and I put it in there, and the lock opened. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. Well, he thought I knew what I was doing picking a lock. That's the only lock I can't open a lock with a key. But he and I got along well. He was interesting. He was nice. But I think the CID was scared of him. And he was the real combat vet. Some of those guys, there was a guy who lived next door to me one time. I was kind of scared of him, too. But I remember meeting Colonel Simons. He was the toughest guy at Fort Bragg. He was the nicest person you ever met in your life. He was just a delightful gentleman. But this guy Harrison, I think the CID was scared of him. And he was very nice to me. I always liked him. I enjoyed chatting with him. And you would talk about normal things, cars and football and whatever. Jeff knew him, but if you're in the unit, you know the people in the unit. I mean, if there are 3 captains in a unit, you know the other 2. And so that didn't shock me by any means. As I say, I knew the guy that lived next door. Oh, okay. The prosecution made a big to-do out of the fact that there was an Esquire magazine that had an article on the Sharon Tate's murder. And every magazine in the world had an article in there about that. And I think the Manson trial may have been going on, if not then, pretty close to that. Oh, yeah, and to me, it was a non sequitur. I mean, I'd hate to see what's on the magazines in my den. I mean, everything in the world. There's no question about it, I know. But I mean, to me, that made absolutely no sense because I think they subscribed to the magazine, if I'm not mistaken. Heaven knows what's going to come in my next subscription. Well, you believe what I wrote 50 years ago and not what I'm saying today. I definitely felt like I was being followed. And I talked to Jeff, came by my office, and I wanted to talk to him, but I didn't want to talk to him in my office. And so the Blue Knights, or whatever it is, the Air Force equivalent team was at Pope Air Force Base, and we went down there to watch him. And we were in my car and pulled in, and it was a good private place to be. I was asking him, getting to know him, and also asking him a lot of questions and just telling him what we were going to do, what was going on, and this, that, and the other. And I do remember a car coming in, and it looked like to me they could have parked anywhere but where they parked so they could see me. And being paranoid, I watched that. And on other occasions, I'm trying to think, I just had to. I was one time I stopped at a stoplight, and the MPs came up behind me, and I saw them behind me, and I started out, and I hadn't gone 50 feet, and they pulled me for speeding. Well, I got hot. I said, we're going to pace this thing off. There's no way this car will go that speed in that length of time. You were right behind me at the stop and shop sign. They weren't prepared for some captain who's really irate to give them a hard time. They let me go. But they were behind me. They knew who I was. And when Mike Malley and I were going over, I told you earlier, they came over the radio they were looking after. So they were following us. I vaguely remember going into the PX with Jeff because we would go to different places, to talk. And he was okay as long as he was with me. And at first I didn't trust his escort officer. That's one reason he trusted Harrison, because he was an escort officer you could trust. It wasn't working for the CIA, but CID, and I assumed afterwards that all of them were good, because we knew where they came from. There was I vaguely remember that, but I wasn't at they searched the whole building one time looking for a pistol or something. And they searched MacDonald and everything he owned, and it'd be like, check this pocket for a .38 pistol or something. And I don't know whether they were looking for something or whether it was intimidation. I know that Jeff, on a number of occasions, he and his escort officer would put their papers in a certain order, a certain stack, or make it 1 inch off this corner sticking out or something like that, and they'd come back 45 minutes later and it'd be all different. And I'm pretty sure that somebody, and I don't believe it was the prosecution, the attorneys, they're not going to do that, neither Cliff nor Bill. But I think some of the MPs of the CID may have. Yeah, it would. And, I'm trying to think. I mean, three or four times I would look in my car with a mirror and I would see a car and I would do a loop and he'd still be behind me. No. But I think that was the individuals and not the Army. And I think that didn't bother me. I, for example, if they found anything, if it went back to the prosecution found out it came from that source, that'd have been trouble for them, not for me. So I didn't think the Army. That's what I felt. Well, most of the evidence that supported Jeff's story was the evidence that didn't support the government. All we had to do, as I used to say, is pop the prosecution's balloon. But by the same token, I'll give you a good example. I think it was a major that lived over near Jeff, and I can't remember his name. And we had a written statement that talked about how he had talked to Colette, and Colette had threatened to kill Jeff. And we were worried about that. And he was off on leave somewhere. Jeff says, that makes no sense. He's a really nice guy. He lives down the street or something like that. He came back and he said, oh, yeah. I went with Jeff out, and he was showing me the pony he bought the children for Christmas. And he said, Colette's going to kill me when she finds out I did this. You've made the same comment. So that went, the evidence went from terrible to perfect. And they didn't put him on. But he was a big witness at one time. And as you went into Jeff, our evidence was there was no motive that we could find. We found evidence of third parties. We felt in the house. We felt in the area. And the more evidence of that you put forth, the government should have had to overcome that. And they really didn't. They didn't make an effort. Well, I'm trying to think. It may not have been, I'm trying to remember when. Helena Stokely at one point told somebody that when she was in the house, she got a telephone call. And she answered the phone and laughed. We found somebody, and I don't know when it was downtown, and had gone to see Dr. MacDonald, who was a doctor in town. And it was that morning, and it was feeling bad that night. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, he called the wrong Dr. MacDonald's, and somebody answered the phone, and this crazy woman was laughing. And he knew he had the wrong number, so he hung up and called the other Dr. MacDonald. She talked about that before we were able to find him. By the same token, she said she combed her hair with a hairbrush. And the hairbrush did have a long strand of synthetic fiber that came off a wig or a doll or something like that. I don't remember exactly. And then again, you corrected me, but she told somebody there was a hobby horse in that house. And I've never seen a photograph of the hobby horse. As you said, there may have been. But she seemed to know things, and know things that we didn't know. We'd been studying it. Oh, yeah. But you would have thought they would. I know one of the things that struck me is Jeff didn't have a lot of blood on him. He had blood on his mouth, but he said he gave attempted artificial respiration. But he didn't have blood all over him. I think there are a dozen witnesses that will say that. Well, if you do what happened, I remember the photographs, there would have been blood splattered all over you. I mean, it just couldn't have been any other way. What? That's the last question I always ask. I'm not being put on the spot. I'm just trying to think, because I've talked about more things today than I have the last 20 years. I just hope I got it all right. No, I always got along well with him. And did I have faith in him in any way? Well, when my son was a year old and he had a bad cut over his eye, I went straight to Jeff. I didn't go to the emergency room. And I really did. We bundled him up in the car and rode right down and took him in. Which is, my son was pretty important to me, if you want to know the truth.